How's everybody doing today? I guess the sound system works. I can hear myself 3 times over. If you're eating chow, please continue. We got plenty of chow, as you can see. I'm Jeff Phillips. I'm the Executive Director / CEO of the Reserve Organization of America. It's a real pleasure to have you here. Reserve Organization of America is a doing business as name for the Reserve Officers Association. Since our membership is open to all ranks, we rethought the name, but our charter name is Reserve Officers Association. We've been around 100 years. In fact, we were founded October 2, 1922 in the Willard Hotel, and we'll be celebrating our centennial year in about the same time, September 29 to October 2 of this year, and we're actually having a grand reception in the very room in the Willard where we were formed 100 years ago, the Crystal Room. And I personally went on a force recon there to identify the room in the Willard from the black and white photograph we have of that first meeting. ROA was founded by about 140 veterans of World War I. And these were all Army officers. They were all in the reserve. They came together under the prompting of General Blackjack Pershing. And Pershing, as did they, was watching the dismantling of the Army at that period. Between the armistice and 1919, the Army shed 3 million men. And so these combat vets were watching this, and they knew, as veterans do know, that there would be another war. In fact, they were seeing Versailles, and they were already recognizing that Versailles was flawed. And they assumed that there was going to be trouble ahead. And so they formed ROA to ensure that we had, in the words of that day, an adequate defense. And they went to work with a special focus on the Reserve and the Guard, both the Reserve and the Guard. As we know, that one of the famed divisions, the 42nd Rainbow Division, was comprised almost entirely Guardsmen from, something like 29 different states. And they succeeded. They increased appropriations over the years, and ultimately their work ensured that General Marshall, starting in about 1940, going into the Pearl Harbor period, had about 100,000 Army Reserve officers on which he could rebuild the American Army that eventually grew to about 8 million men and women at the end of the war. So ROA, from its earliest days, has been tightly focused on the supportive readiness of the Guard and Reserve. In fact, some of our earliest efforts were to support the fledgling, forgive the pun, the fledgling Air Corps Reserve. And we marched in the parade that celebrated the achievement of Charles Lindbergh, who, because of his crossing of the Atlantic in 1927, May 1927, was given a colonelcy in the Air Corps Reserve. And in the magazines on the tables, which is our centennial version of our magazine, I encourage you to take 1 or 20. There's a photograph of him in connection with that event. So I think it is especially appropriate that you're here, that we're talking about kind of the new Air Corps Reserve, or the new Air Corps, the new initiative, and that's the Space Force. And ROA definitely wants to play a role, intends to play a role in how this works out. And it can be seen as very late in the game, or it can be seen as early in the game, as we know with the formation of our air services. Started out in World War I flying all French airplanes. We didn't have our own airplanes. And that was sorted out over decades. And then it was resorted out in 1947, what the Air Force would look like and what the Air Guard would look like. So this is a continuing process, and it's very important that our voices be involved. We see evidence that the Pentagon is clamming up right now. They don't want to talk about it. And one of the reasons I assume they don't want to talk about it is they really don't know what's going to happen. They don't want to get involved in a food fight at this point. But it is very important that the mix, as I call it, as a former staffer, the mix that's involved in this and interested in this, come together, discuss it, think about it, do events like this, do bigger events. And so I think we're in on not at the creation perhaps, but pretty darn close to it. We're going to watch a very short video here about ROA. It's about 2 minutes. And then I'm going to introduce a very important person who is our co-collaborator in this event, and that's Colonel William Wolf of the Space Forces Association. Could we play the video, please? America, and in fact the free world, is facing unprecedented threats.
With Iran possibly months from being able to produce a nuclear weapon.
Fighting rages on in eastern Ukraine as the Russian invasion enters week 7.
We cannot go to war without the reserves.
We've been called up more in the last 20 years than the history of the Strategic Reserve.
At least since 9/11, they've turned into an operational reserve.
Since the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the National Guards are no longer considered reserve troops. The Guard is now an integral part of the American military.
The Reserve Organization of America, ROA, is the only national military organization which solely and exclusively represents the reserve components. ROA appreciates the opportunity to testify today and address certain bills that apply in particular to our reserve force. The Pentagon itself has told us the usage rate is not going to go down.
The manning levels that we need within the budget constraints requires this shift into more and more citizen warriors.
The policies were not built for a reserve and guard used at this level that we're seeing right now.
So as we look towards the future, ROA has a critical role in supporting that citizen warrior.
Original history was to have a reserve force in case you had that conflict, but now we're using them for everything.
ROA has improved the readiness of the force by advocating for additional funding and the purchase of equipment so that members of the Guard and Reserve have what they need.
There are other organizations out there that help the Guard specifically. There's other organizations out there who have Reserve and Guard as a piece of their overall mission, but there is nobody else in the entire world who can handle those questions for our Reserve and Guard.
You have the VA asking ROA to be part of the discussion on certain topics.
What is an untold story is that there's a 20% plus unemployment rate for our reservists.
I would like to see more employers hire reserve component members or Guard members.
And that's what ROA and the Citizen Warrior Coalition are fighting for.
We're launching the Reserve Employment Portal and the first ever reserve-focused mentorship program.
One of the challenges of this historically high use of the Reserve and the Guard is that people are leaving their civilian job to serve at unprecedented rates. ROA is working on tax credits for employers who have members of the Guard and the Reserve in their workforce.
We're launching the Reserve Employment Portal, designed specifically to link reservists and guardsmen with employers that are embracing a dual career path.
Another unique ROA initiative is our Stars in Schools program.
When little Johnny or Susie's mom deploys or father deploys, we want to ensure that their teachers, their coaches, their principals know and to give them resources and education to help those children.
Every person in the military should belong to a professional organization, and I think ROA is that professional organization.
They're a family. They're my family.
We've been around for 100 years, providing for national security. And we're embarking on a second 100 years. And we want to do it better and smarter.
ROA has played a vital and long-lasting role, and we will continue to do so, and we need to continue to do so. The country needs ROA. The serving reservists that are out there, they really do need ROA because we're their voice. And we've been able to make really good progress, and we need to continue to do that.
It's time for us to step up to the plate, dig our heels in, and say, hey, it's our turn to take the mantle, pick up the torch, move forward for the next 100 years.
ROA is going to be bigger and stronger than it ever was.
Bill Hippie Wolf is a retired Air Force colonel and president. I'm going to read all this.
Are you really?
Yeah.
Isn't that good?
Because I think it's pretty damned impressive.
Okay.
He's an Air Force colonel and president and chief executive officer of the Space Force Association. Bill is also the CEO of the Wolf Consulting Group, LLC. The Wolf Consulting Group provides strategic advisory services in space and multi-domain operations. Colonel Wolf served over 24 years in the Air Force, retiring in 2018. He is a career space and nuclear officer in high-impact operations, staff leadership, and technical program management positions, with peerless depth and breadth of experience in advanced space programs and the Joint All-Domain Command and Control. Bill is a graduate of the United States Air Force Weapons School. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce our co-collaborator from the Space Force Association, Colonel Wolf. Hippie.
Yes,
Thank
sir.
you. And get around behind you.
Thank you, General Phillips. I really do appreciate it. What an honor it is to be collaborating on such an important event at such an important time in our nation's history here in DC at ROA headquarters. Thanks so much for allowing SFA to be a collaborator in this event. Again, to talk about probably one of the most important initiatives that we need to figure out as a nation. Nothing is more important than being able to call on our citizens on a moment's notice to increase strategic capability for our military infrastructure. As a reservist myself, the last 12 years of my career, I spent as a reservist, and a lot of that time was focused on talking about space as a warfighting domain in the Air Force. So this space as a warfighting domain is not a new concept, but it's a new concept that we're talking about. And the reserve componency is not a new concept, but we're now having to have a very specific discussion about the pros and cons of either establishing a new componency or using our existing infrastructure. And these are the discussions we have to have. And it has to be transparent. So if a new componency is something that we need to do, then let's just have a discussion about why it would be better for this nation and what it's going to provide that our current infrastructure doesn't provide. I know a couple of folks that I've spoken to in industry is, will a new componency description allow industry to use reserve component like they have in the past? What type of credibility do we have to establish if we develop that new reserve componency? Or do we use the system that we've been using for hundreds of years that's worked very well? And again, these are just questions that we have to answer. Is establishing a new reserve componency going to cost the Space Force more money or less money? The taxpayer cares about how we're spending our tax dollars. So a little bit about the Space Force Association. It's not been established for 100 years. We actually established our organization in 2019, in October of 2019. It was because for my career in the Air Force, I didn't know the capabilities we were working on to gain and maintain space superiority. All I knew is we were being delivered capabilities to operators that we were then told to execute the space superiority mission. Again, the space superiority mission has been around for years. We've been talking about it for years. Space as a warfighting domain has been around for years. So now we need to ensure that the space community has the capability they need, the Guardians have the capability they need to accomplish their space superiority mission. And so that's why the Space Force Association was established, to provide a unifying voice for the Space Force Guardians and their family, dedicated to ensure they have the capabilities they need to do their job. And so what have we been doing for the last couple of years? Well, quite a bit. We've established the National Space Power Center here in Washington, D.C., where we're working with industry partners to bring capabilities into universities and establish the University Partners in Space program so we can help define what that workforce is going to look like in the future and help develop the curriculum that that workforce is going to need to understand to baseline the space superiority mission set and the understanding of space superiority. Because quite honestly, there's a lot of confusion out there. What is space superiority? Who's talking? What are they talking about? What are the key components of space superiority? You know, in the past, and I was just talking to Tim Adam over here, the DC chapter president of SFA, and he said, well, I did space. So what's your background, Tim? I did space. Well, that's going to be a brand new discussion in the future. It's not going to be, I did space. It's going to be, I did orbital warfare. I did space electronic warfare. I did space situational awareness. I did cyberspace defense. I did space intelligence. So these are the different career tracks that people are going to go down. Space Force is developing that, and we need to ensure the workforce is there to support the private sector, civil sector, and of course the military sector. So we're working with the education sector to create that through Global Space University underneath the National Space Power Center. We have information on the Global Space University over here. Integrity ISR is partnered with us to create course content to help to baseline the professional understanding of what space superiority is. So we're really happy about Global Space University and where that is going to help create the professionals we know we need in the future. And then we're standing up chapters around the world. We just stood up our latest chapter in Huntsville. We've got a chapter in Texas. We've got a chapter that's standing up in New Mexico. We, of course, have our Falls Around chapter that was our first one in Colorado Springs. We've got the DC chapter here. We've got a chapter that's going to be standing up in Dayton, Ohio. And we've got a chapter that's stood up in the UK. And Australia is soon to follow. So we are working to ensure there's a voice around the globe to talk about why the space superiority mission is so important. So that's another initiative we've been working on and really excited about. Our legislative priorities have been pretty much the same since we started. Does the Space Force have the resources it needs to do its job? And one point on that is perhaps 22 general officer billets in the Space Force isn't enough to grow to 4-star general officers. Perhaps you need to look at just a minimum of 36 general officer billets in the Space Force to support the creation of 2 4-star general officers and create the bench that we know we need to create that next future leader in the Space Force. So that's just one of them, but the other priority that we've been working on and why we brought General Lingle onto our board of directors is to get the Space National Guard across the finish line. And again, I believe it doesn't matter what we do organizationally, but we need to do it because there is a lot at risk from a mission perspective. Because if we start doing and looking at planning resources and planning allocation, perhaps some of those resources are moved to different mission sets. And we got to be careful about that because we want to keep the workforce and the professionals in the service that they signed up and the mission that they signed up to support. So those are just a couple of things that we've been working on. We're really excited about where SFA is going. And again, every military branch has a professional organization dedicated to that military service. The Space Force Association is solely dedicated to the Space Force Guardians and their families. And we provide a platform to inform, advocate, and educate. And I'll just leave you with a really brief video that summarizes what we've been working on. And I'm looking forward to today's discussion. I see a lot of friends in the audience. We'll be hearing from General Feldman later on and Colonel Newts, as well as General Lingle, Colonel Stanley. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, and we'll have an industry panel here in just a little while. So I'm looking forward to hearing from them on the importance of the reserve component, their perspective, and again, provide this platform for educating folks on what the current issues are and how we can move forward.
Be included, or what they would like to have seen in the as a Space Force component and the reserve component and the possible National Guard. Our, I guess, co-legislative director, Susan Lucas, did a deep dive into it. And I would like to show you kind of her analysis into what was in that tranche of legislation, and then I can answer your questions after it.
Hi, my name is Susan Lucas, and today I'd like to talk to you about the legislation that the Department of Defense has proposed to Congress for the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2023. It really is a big piece of law. It goes many pages, goes into a lot of detail, and as I got into it, I found that they really are trying to not be held by the way things have always been, but perhaps put together a force with personnel systems and organization that are a little bit different. I mean, who could resist the opportunity to basically start fresh and not be held back by the as is? So you certainly can't fault them for that. Probably the biggest thing with this is that it is so big. I'm not really quite sure that it can get through this year. So this year we're in the 117th second session. It's already June. The committees have already been marking up for a while. The NDAA came a little bit later, a little bit further down into the year. And it has so much in it that it would not surprise me at all if Congress didn't pass it this year. That's not to say that they're not going to pass it and that they don't like it. I think what it really harkens more to the fact that they will wait until the 118th when they have 2 new years of a Congress to really delve into all of the details. It will give them a chance to have hearings. It will give them a chance for staff to sit there and discuss from other Pentagon staff. It'll help congressional staff to Pentagon staff get into it and look at the different parts, because you can't just take it as a whole. I mean, it really is so detailed. It's one of those where you're going to go, section by section by section by section. And the reason you do that is because they are changing things. You have to look and say, okay, this is what you're changing. This is what you intend to do, but are there going to be any unintended consequences? And that's really what happens in law a lot, is you want to avoid the unintended consequences. Quite obviously, you can't do that because you can't anticipate everything that's going to come up. So your next best thing is to say, okay, I want to avoid unintended consequences, or certainly as much as possible. So that means I need to write a law that is written in a way that it is flexible, so that when things change, the law doesn't have to change with it. The law is flexible enough in the way that it's written that the details of how it's executed, which can be changed, are in regulations, guidance, and things like that. So that's really the best law. The best law gives you the framework for what you want to do. The details come in by the agency that puts it together, and that is the part that changes more, not the law. But the law does change. We've seen that with the GI Bill. We've seen that with, other big pieces of law. You can't have law that big and not change. But what you hope to do is minimize the change that ends up occurring. So let's get into it as we go through. Obviously, I'm not going to go section by section because it's like, who really wants to do that? And there's no way it could be done in a short amount of time. So I want to just cover the highlights of what I found when I was going through it. I think by the way, the proposed law went over to Congress 1 April 2022. So probably the biggest part of it, the statement that foretells everything, is that it establishes the space component, which includes all members, units, and organization currently in the regular Space Force and Air Force Reserve. So right now, remember, the Space Force is, for the most part, resident in the Air Force. So what that statement is saying, and it's really a big statement. It seems like it's a little statement, but it's really a big statement, because it says they're going to take all the members, units, and organization currently in the Air Force and bring it over into Space Force. Once it's in Space Force, it'll become the space component. They did say that it is going to be voluntary, and that individuals who do not want to leave the Air Force and go over to Space Force and become a guardian, they will take care of that. Normally, they take care of that with early separations, attrition, things like that. Probably the telling point of the statement is, you notice it does not include a statement saying that the Air National Guard is going to come over with this. So they are leaving that part of it out. And in part, they're leaving it out because that's still under discussion. There is a law that has been introduced that establishes a separate National Guard space. And so we'll see that for the most part, the law that is submitted talks about the federal forces. When they go on to describe what they're putting together, because as you know, there's a preamble to it all. What they talk about is they want to remove traditional barriers. And that really does explain a lot of what they ended up doing. They believe that, and as anybody that's worked legislation will know, Title 10 does have some problems with it. that make it harder to manage and use your force. And so what they're trying to do is overcome some of that. So more of the statements that they use that explain what they're doing in their proposals coming forward is they want mobilized assets to be continuously integrated. Probably the easiest way to understand that, because as you know, these words sometimes are so generic that it's like, well, what the heck did you really mean? In this case, mobilized assets continually integrated, they're really talking about the Air Force Reserve and active duty associate model, which is, you know, it's not a separate reserve unit. It's not a separate Air Force unit. It's an active unit. It's an active unit with reserve manpower as part of it. So in that regard, it's not I mean, they kind of say it's a new system, but it's not. It's what we know as the associate unit. They want to reduce transitions between full and part-time. Everybody has wanted that. They want to increase permeability to recruit critical skills and retain that what they see themselves as a very technical workforce. And even in one part of it, they say we're science, we're math, we're technology. Everybody is. They want officers to receive a single appointment. That's kind of a big thing. That's been discussed before, but there was a constitutional perspective of it. And in this document, they say they've overcome it. And the reason they've overcome it in their mind is because they are not asking for a separate reserve component. They are asking for the reserve, what we know as the reserve, or the part-time, or the part-time, that I'll explain that a little bit further. So they really have an active duty, which is tiered 3 ways with participation. You have the full-time active, the individual who may do more, and then the minimum. So the one who does it more in the middle is the one who, you know, as we know, is done today, is called up based on operational needs, you know, augments exercises, is deployed for a shorter period than active. But what's unusual in this case is they want it all to be active. That's how they can get around this, you know, officers receiving a single appointment. Now we have a regular and reserve appointment. But if we don't have reserve anymore, then we only have a regular appointment. It's just those individuals regular don't all work full time. They don't want a separate, as I said before, they don't want a separate organizational structure. They don't want separate promotions. They don't want separate compensation, benefits, or incentives. That goes back to what you refer to as parity, which we have been working. So a lot of what they're asking for, to a certain degree, already exists. If you remember correctly, you know, I went back and said they want to reduce the transition between full and part-time. Well, we've been wanting it too. In fact, DOD spent years working on duty status reform. So Congress or DOD worked for years on duty status reform. They put it all together. I think the last I heard, if I remember correctly, they had said over 400 sections or pieces of law end up getting changed. And we got to the point where it was ready to go forward, and then it got hung up. It's hung up in OMB, Office of Management and Budget. We're asking for it to come out. And the reason we're asking for it to come out is to do exactly what they said, reduce transitions, because it's going to reduce what the 34 duty statuses into 8 categories. So it would make it easier. In order to do what they want to do with the force, they said that they're going to adopt talent management practices. The services are already doing that too. And when they talk about talent management practices, it's funny, if anybody that was in the military for any length of time knows that there's always a buzzword, you know, or a system for management, you know, total quality management. Right now it's all talent management practices. And basically talent management practices are really making it easier for people to basically meet their needs to a certain degree, but meet the services needs. And so an example is what's happened with warrant officers, because there's law that also went over at this time about warrant officers. And what it's saying is that warrant officers may not want to promote, or may be in a position where they like being. And so they are passing a law that would allow them to not have to go to a promotion board and can basically, pull themselves back. And the whole reason for it is that they may need time to finish their degree. They may need, something going on that needs to be met in their civilian job, and they're not ready to meet yet. They may want to try to get command under their belt. So that's part of what talent management is. And that is a lot of what they're putting into it, or is that flexibility, so to speak. So as I talked about before, they're established in 3 categories: active status, which is the regular and ready reserve, what we know is the regular and ready reserve, inactive status, and then retired. If you are in an active status, you're not participating, but you can be called up without consent at any time. For the movement of forces from the Air Force into space, it disestablishes the regular Space Force in the Air Force by October 1st, 2027. So they're giving themselves 4 years to get there. The training is pretty much the same. So they've done that a lot. They've taken a lot of what's already existing in that regard. It's 48 drills, 14 AT, up to 30 days. So that part doesn't change. I thought this was kind of interesting. For officers, it says that their training requirement is 50 points. But the interesting part was anything above can be assigned to a previous or subsequent year if either one of those years are lacking. So I thought that was interesting because, think about it, why not? If the whole point of this training minimum is training and you get it done, sometimes the hardest part is getting it done in the right fiscal year, and not because the individual isn't getting it done, because we end up we're living with a continuing resolution, or the budget doesn't get approved, and so through no fault of the members, they could end up not getting enough points. Another thing that was really interesting is you must be a citizen of the U.S. And the reason I say that that's interesting is because a lot of the critical career fields that are in the Army, in particular medical, are done through recruiting of individuals who want to be citizens, and so they recruit into the military, and that earns them a path to citizenship. But because of the security clearance requirements, space is saying that they cannot deal with that or have that as part of it. They are also doing opt out of promotion, as I spoke about before, but has to be in the best interest of Space Force. That's going to be interesting because the best interest of Space Force, that can be subjective. So when they say, best interest of Space Force, are they going to put some objective standards in there? I don't know. Time and grade is going to be the same. One thing that was interesting, again, is they are no longer going to discharge officers after a 2-time passover. And how they'll handle it is with selective continuation. I didn't read anything about enlisted, but I'm really hoping that they put this concept in for enlisted too. In other words, enlisted shouldn't have to, be kicked out after a certain period because they only make staff sergeant or E5. It's like, well, if they're being effective, they're fine with E5, why can't they stay in and get their 20 to 30 years? So I hope some of those requirements for getting people out of enlisted also go to, officers go to enlisted and allow them to stay. Because if an individual is doing their job, then why can't they stay? Especially I think a lot of what may be driving this, or hopefully they're thinking about it, what's driving it is recruiting is expensive. It's expensive to get them in. It's expensive to train them. There is a much smaller part of the population that can come in. So we need to really start giving more attention to retention and keep the assets, the experience, the leadership that we've developed, keep it longer. I mean, that's really the crux of the reserve anyway in the Guard, is we end up staying longer than active duty. And that gives us that chance on that one system to become an expert that, you know, can deal with any crisis that ends up coming along. So I'm hoping that they think about that more and come up with it. Again, that is not anywhere near everything that they covered, but hopefully what you'll see, it is enough. There's enough difference. There's enough change that Congress will say, no, we're not going to include it in the fiscal year 2023 NDAA. We're going to move this very big legislative package into the 118th and give not only Congress, but the military service organizations, the veteran service organizations, you know, the National Guard, the Reserve, everybody a chance to weigh in on all of this. And quite honestly, some of this is so different. There's a part of me that would like to say, can we not do some of this as a pilot before we just jump in? I mean, we're jumping into something we have no idea where it may go, but we have enough knowledge and history of what's happened that maybe we need to take it slower and start letting it play out and see what's going to end up happening with it. So thank you for staying with me as we go through that. I hope it wasn't totally boring, and that you'll join me as we go forward with this legislation, and maybe not just be so set in the way that things have always been done that we aren't willing to look at ways that it could be done, but also temper with what we have seen in the past. So thank you very much.
Yes. Okay. And Susan apologizes for not being here to be able to take your questions after her. I will do my best to take your questions if you have any. I will say to kind of add on to what Susan presented from the ROA membership side, we would say that, you know, as a traditional reservist myself in the Air Force, the full-time, part-time construct is great. You know, I think when I was active duty, if there was a way to become more, to kind of flow in and out based on my personal needs and personal desires, I would have taken that. That would have been great. But then now we have other questions, especially when she says that there's going to be kind of one line, like active duty kind of holds the promotions and evaluations. Now, if I were to phase into part-time, am I now being evaluated against my full-time folks? And what is that going to look like? You know, am I competing against someone who's there every day? And of course, as a traditional reservist, there is someone there every day, and I see that they get more exposure, more credit for some of the work that they do, and I'm only there around 40 days of a year. So, and that kind of ties into some other membership concerns, like mostly from our Coast Guard friends. A lot of our Coast Guard memberships, they feel like they've been in this movie before, and they didn't have anyone to advocate for them on the Coast Guard Reserve side because full-time's got it. You know, they just augment the full-time side or the active duty side of the Coast Guard. And who is their advocate? Who is there to say, hey, you know what, these part-time folks or these part-time bases or these facilities need to be, you know, addressed, and they're cautious about this model because they've kind of lived this life before, and they're I guess I don't want to say not sold, but they're very cautious. Any questions? Okay, awesome. Sure.
All right. So you're talking about duty status reform, sort of like, are any of these attributes of this new service model, did they have any of those things
tried to would get changed in the other duty status reform that you talked about that had gone on for years and is still trying to go on inside Pentagon?
I want to say, so without having the details on that, that it is looking like it's going to be addressed, the specific questions. So I don't want to say if it's fully baked in and they have the panacea to be able to do what we want to do, but I think because they're kind of starting from fresh and they have a specific model for how they're going to do their force, I think that would be a part of how to bring someone active. Again, the same thing, the mechanics.
Let me rephrase the question. I guess this new service, what is different about it that duty status reform wasn't doing? Was duty status reform attempting to modify the duty status, the issues with coming on and off duty, all of those other issues were trying to be addressed inside of duty status reform, as I recall?
Right, and I want to say that's where I think the singular appointment comes into hand that Susan was talking about. You wouldn't have to scroll if you had to go into the reserve component. I don't know how that would look, but if I'm a full-time guardian and then I decide, hey, I'm going to work for SpaceX, can I go part-time? I don't know what paperwork I'd have to add or what my work would be. Do I have to come in 3 times a week, 4 times a week? What are the conditions for me to be able to do that? So I think because that part is a new construct, I don't think the duty status reform that we're working on as it is would maybe apply one-to-one just because it's completely different. Because duty status reform would be, as someone who's scrolled as a reservist in the Air Force, I don't know how that would look like if you're a full-time guardian that just says, okay, cool, I'm just going to go part-time now, but stay on the same appointment, and where that is. Does that kind of hit where you're asking? Yeah? Good enough? Thanks. Okay. Oh, we got one more.
Real quickly, because I'm new to this, but we do have, I'm from G357 Strategic Ops in the Army, and we do have a space division. Unfortunately, they couldn't get here today. But the question I've got, as I listened to Susan's description of the NDAA, is what are the examples of DoD capabilities that are new? Did you all look at in terms of the method or the procedures that you want to use to bring about the Space Force? Specifically, let's just walk through aviation, the aviation branch in the Army. You go back to Vietnam, there was no aviation branch. There was no special forces. Did you look at how those evolved, not only for active, but for Guard and Reserve, for both of those? Or other, like best example most recently, cyber. So that's where I'm starting my questions.
What I would say, again, from the ROA perspective is that, Susan likes to say, you can't talk about space without talking about cyber.
That's not the question.
Okay.
What are the examples of other capabilities you studied in order to come up with how you want to formulate the active Guard Reserve Space Forces? Did you consider that?
I don't think I'd be able to answer that question. And I may actually defer to some of our next speakers. Okay.
The reason I ask that is because one could not exist without support from the other.
Right, absolutely. Part of this deal is this sort of discussion about what capabilities we want to see resident in the various components, however they shake out. The formation of special forces under the sponsorship of JFK was as a result of a new kind of war that we were fighting, and he saw a need. So here we are, we're going to launch in this, we've only been in space since, 1945, but so we're determining what we need. So ROA has not sat down, I think it would be a bit presumptuous if we did, and said, this is what we think should be in the mix. And that's why forums such as this are so important, because we bring together people and they say, well, have you thought about that? Have you thought about that? This might not work. For those of us who are in the reserves, we know that life isn't always good when you're under the mastery of active component 4-star generals who have never served in the reserve and can barely spell it in some cases. So when we look at the formation of perhaps a Space Force Reserve, who's going to help develop that? Is it just going to be an active component hierarchy? or is it going to be a heterogeneous mix? Does that help answer your question?
It does. It tells me that you need to really sit down and study the history.
Oh, absolutely.
Because Compo 1 could not survive or follow through on the completion of duties without backfill. Unfortunately, generally cherry picking instead of unit
Right.
utilization from the reserve components either. So, there's a number of other, but I'm just asking that.
Yeah, absolutely, right, yeah. And of course, the Compo 1's dependence on Compos 2 and 3 really, with the exception of certain specialties such as air transport, has really developed since and including Desert Shield. Up until then, they were not dependent. The Army was not dependent on the Army Reserve.
No, I'm not picking on it.
Yeah, but so this is a developing thing.
Good afternoon. I'm Tom Hugh, ROA. So just to maybe help, where are we in the process if this is the conversation? Is this like the very first meeting of the minds, or how long before this? I know at our national convention last October, we had a gentleman from Air University who spoke about Space Force and the need for a reserve component in the Space Force. He happens to be an Air Force Space Command reservist, and he made a compelling argument. That's the first time that I'm aware that we ever really talked about Space Force because it is so new, and this collaboration with the Space Force Association is a good thing. But is there a roadmap where we're going? Is this the first step, and then there's many more steps that we can inform Congress, as ROA has been doing for 100 years, and Space Force for 3 years, Space Force Association. Where are we in the path?
Sure. I would characterize, so as specific to ROA, where we are, this would be maybe the largest kickoff that we have. I know other organizations have developed their stance on this, but we get such a vast amount of feedback, very diverse amount of feedback from our members. This would be the first, and because we haven't even touched the National Guard portion yet on how big, if we're kind of that here. So from the ROA perspective, we have two departments. So Illinois and Georgia have both sent us resolutions that the resolutions committee here at ROA will be addressing at the convention here. But yeah, I think this forum here is the number one thing to maybe do a large kickoff to say, hey, where are we at, what we want to do, because we're getting a lot of feedback on from our members.
Thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate that. Appreciate the insights and the updates. And yeah, there's a much larger, much broader conversation that we need to continue to discuss. I think we're able to bring up the video now, but while that's coming up, I do want to say events like this cannot happen without support from our corporate sponsors. And so I'd like to thank all of our corporate sponsors, but especially our title sponsor, L3 Harris, and the representatives that they sent here today. So thanks so much for being here today. Let's give them a round of applause.
Come on, kiddo.
Let's go see the dip. And the little one.
For years, space has remained an uncontested domain. Potential adversaries have developed systems to contest U.S. space superiority.
Breaking news, the Pentagon
The world's
Hospitals
largest
to ransomware
attack.
The largest
Getting everything from
public
groceries to
transport
gas.
in the United States.
The United States Space Force was established to defend our way of life. Kinetic threats to U.S. satellites can be denied through non-kinetic means. The SFA mission is to achieve superior national space power by helping to shape a strong space force, whether by land, sea, or air. Military dominance is always won by command of the highest ground.
Power cleared.
SFA works with industry partners such as Sierra Nevada Corporation and their Dream Chaser program to examine what's in the art of possible for future capabilities. The Space Force Association provides an opportunity to research, inform, and advocate for a strong Space Force. Show your support by signing up today at ussfa.org, catalyzing space power at home and on the frontier.
And if you're not a member, you can go there right now and sign up. Now, thanks for showing that video. I appreciate that. We spent a lot of time trying to visualize a contested space domain, because it's funny, you don't really think about a contested space domain until you can actually see it or see the effects. But that's the fact is you can't see the effects. So when we say we're in a contested environment, a contested domain, people say, well, I can see aircraft, I can see tanks, and I can see ships, but I can't see satellites. So you have to start to equate the criticality of the mission to the characteristics of the capabilities that we have on orbit. So that's why we put that video together, was to show that. I've gotten the honor to introduce a very dear friend of mine who's been a mentor for me throughout my career. So people would say, oh, it's your fault. And he would say, absolutely, it is my fault. Brigadier General Damon Feltman, he hired me as the replacement to the functional area manager at Air Force Reserve Command when he went on to take command of 19th Space Operations Squadron, and then go on to take command of the 310 Space Wing, the only space wing in Air Force Reserve Command. Brigadier General Damon Feltman now is the mobilization assistant to the Deputy Chief of Space Operations, Strategy Plans, Programs, Requirements, and Analysis, United States Space Force. As a member of the executive staff, he leads development of the service's Future Years Defense Program, international partnerships, space system requirements, and strategic planning. Please join me in welcoming Brigadier General Damon Feltman.
Thank you, everybody. I want to make sure that I've got this right. Is this the clicker? Okay, got it. Okay, so thanks for the invitation to be here. And for record, I'm a lifetime member of ROA, so I joined in 2007. And I'm a charter member of Space Force Association. So when Bill had this crazy idea of forming the Space Force Association, he bounced a couple ideas off of me, and when he said that they were taking memberships, I joined up pretty quickly. I think he floated me for a few months. He tolerated me not contributing, but eventually I paid in, and my dues are current, so I took care of that this year. So the conversation that I want to have today is not in detail specific to the legislative proposal. Okay, I want to set the groundwork here. But what I think it is very valuable for folks who aren't quite familiar with what the reserve, and you can extend this over to the Guard. What we do in the space mission is not very well known by people outside of that community. For context, within the Air Force Reserve, we're about 70,000 authorizations, and inside of those 70,000, there's about 1,400 space ops folks. The Air National Guard, 300,000 plus, I don't remember the exact number, and there are about 1,100 space ops folks in there. So a small percentage of manpower authorizations. But what I want to show you here is that we punch way above our weight. This presentation that I've got for you is geared towards the reserve, but you could probably swap out and put a guardsman up here, and they would give almost the identical brief that I'm about to give to you. Okay, and when we're finished here, what I want to leave you with is that from Damon Feltman's position as a guy who has been in this in the reserve space mission. I was a lieutenant at OneSops when the first reserve space unit was put together back in 1994, so I've seen it from the very, very beginning. I want to leave with you this understanding that the Guard and Reserve in space is very much a strategic asset with operational capacity. And that's the most important thing that we need to keep in mind as all of these conversations are going on, that at the end of the day, there are today airmen, maybe someday guardians, that we're talking about here. And these airmen do incredibly valuable things day in and day out. So with that, if we could bring the slide deck up, please. There we go. If I will bring the slide deck up. Okay. So I'd like to ask you all to participate in a bit of a thought experiment. The age of powered flight will turn 120 next year, and orbital space flight will turn 63 in October. Okay, so just take a moment and think, what were some of the greatest challenges in air power starting from absolutely nothing and getting to where we are today? Was it simply learning about how to employ this new thing called an aeroplane in combat? What about increasing its performance and making it a true game changer in combat, to where we are today? The same question for space. What were the big challenges when we went from nothing to the first orbiting spacecraft? We had to have rocket fuel. We had to have rockets that didn't blow up every time you tried to light one. You had to have satellites that actually took pictures and could recover those pictures and communicate, etc. In focusing a little bit more on space, let's think about the future. Think about what will be the great technical and security challenges over the next 5 years, and even on into the next 20 years, where groups like Boston Consulting Group, McKinsey, Bank of America, et cetera, are openly saying, you can find this just about anywhere on the internet if you just Google it in. The estimates are that the space commercial industry, space commerce, will be a multi-trillion-dollar activity. With numerous and routine activities going on the moon, Mars, and in the asteroids, and there are plenty of authors out there today who are advocating that great power competition will extend out into the deep reaches of space, and there'll be a scramble for the skies. So I ask you to hold on to those thoughts for just a moment. This gentleman is Major Raynald Bolling. In 1917, so this is less than 14 years after the Wright brothers' first flight, Bolling, he had taken some flying lessons. He knew he was a pilot. He was a corporate lawyer by vocation. And in 1917, he was appointed the commander of the 1st Reserve Aero Squadron. And he took that unit to France in 1917 and learned how to employ employ airplanes in combat. When they got over to France, the 1st Aero Squadron was redesignated the 26th Aero Squadron. So what am I doing here? I'm talking to you about an airplane in 1917. Well, the airplane as a combat tool was very much in its infancy, but some of the basic doctrine and tactics established then are still in use today. And not only that, the 26th is still with us. This is the 26th Space Aggressor Squadron at Schriever Air Force Base. And the 26th continues this legacy of tactics development and training the Joint Force by presenting realistic electronic space warfare environments, training environments. And by the way, in case you missed it, Raynald Bolling is the namesake of Bolling Air Force Base here in DC. So by the time World War II rolled around, aviation had improved dramatically thanks in large part to this man. You may not recognize him in this picture, but I bet you recognize him in this one. It's Jimmy Doolittle, and he's taking off from the USS Hornet in April 1942. Doolittle was a member of the Army Air Corps Reserve in the interwar years. And Doolittle was already the most famous airman in the world, having won numerous air races. He had a PhD, or I guess it was an MSD, Master of Science, a science doctorate from MIT in aeronautics. He was an executive at Shell Oil, building 100 low lead gas, what would become 100 low lead. And he was also the first pilot to take off and land completely by instrument. He had the cockpit blacked out and did a complete mission in the dark. Here's Doolittle just a few months after the raid. He's in North Africa with several of his fellow raiders who became the senior cadre of an organization called the 310th Bomb Group. The 310th Bomb Group is now the 310th Space Wing, Schriever Space Force Base, Colorado. And the 310th considers itself a Doolittle unit not only because Doolittle trained most of the first leaders of the organization, but also because of his influence in the space program. Most people don't realize that. that after the war, Doolittle reverted back to reserve status, and he became chairman of the National Advisory Council on Aeronautics, which eventually became NASA. And he also worked with Robert Goddard on rocket fuel. So why did I go all the way back to World War I and World War II for a discussion about space and the reserve in 2022? Well, I could have easily have just started and given you death by PowerPoint on the what we do, what missions we do today. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but this is only part of our story. To me, it's just as important to tell you how the reserve contribution to space has been there from the very beginning. And equally important, it's important for me to tell you who the reserve has in the space mission today, building the next generation of space capabilities. So my last historical example is this fine young gentleman. You may not recognize him, a recent Texas A&M graduate going through air training, and he was a member of the Air Corps Reserve, Army Air Corps Reserve. You might recognize him a little bit more by this picture here. It's Bernard Schriever, who built the Western Development Division and gave us our initial space capabilities back in the late 50s and early 60s. And yes, that's the same Schriever of Schriever Air Force Base, Schriever Space Force Base, Colorado. So these legends are interesting in their own regard, but what is the reserve doing in space today and who's doing it? So this is a laydown of where we are in the missions that we're doing. Like I said at the very beginning, the reserve footprint is about 1,400 authorizations in core space operations billets. What the Air Force refers to as the old 13S and 1 Charlie 6 AFSCs, but it also includes acquisition, it includes intel, it includes a few cyber folks doing specific space activities. Support functions like medical, admin, security, those types of things are not in this 1,400, but the 310th Space Wing does have those embedded in its manning document right now. And the manpower exists in two broad categories. We have our unit program with operations squadrons split between the 310th Space Wing and the 926th Wing, which is actually out at Nellis. Then we have individual augmentees that are in a variety of places, but the heaviest footprints are in Los Angeles and here in DC. And then we also have a handful of space billets in personnel at our headquarters in Warner Robins, Georgia, as well as here in the Pentagon. So 1,400 positions is not a lot. You know, 1,400 versus 70,000, not a lot. But these professionals punch well above their weight because that manpower is focused in key areas. So, for example, Air Force Reserve has about 45% of the manpower authorizations for GPS operations. So the entirety of GPS all originates at Schriever Space Force Base in Colorado. There are two squadrons, an active duty squadron and a reserve squadron. And the entirety of all the GPS that's run on your phone goes out of Mod 11, Building 400, Schriever Space Force Base. We have two of the four space-based missile warning squadrons at Buckley. We have the only operational backup for defense weather satellite programs. We have about 75% of the manpower for defensive space control missions, et cetera. And again, if there were a guardsman standing here next to me, that guardsman would have similar stories about the guards' contribution. And then, of course, our individual augmentees, man, we have some heavy hitters in that portfolio, and I'll introduce you to a few of those folks in just a little bit. But operationally, the Reserve has employed this manpower daily in real-world operations since that first unit that I mentioned, 7SOPS, was formed in 1994. We do that through two ways. One is just the nature of how space operations work and how we maintain our certifications. The part-time reserve force maintains certification on these real-world weapon systems, and that gives contribution to real-world operations day in and day out. But we also mobilize reserve forces. So, for example, since the beginning of FY21, our missile warning squadrons have mobilized nearly 100 people. Our Space Control Squadron, our Defensive Space Control Squadron, deploys about 20 people per year. And then our other missions have mobilized about 30 folks per year. So with my remaining time, what I'd like to do is look into the future through the lens of the people that we've got doing our missions today. Because in my eyes, somewhere in this mix of 1,400 people may be the next Bolling, Doolittle, or Schriever. So I'm going to give this a shot here. This is Xiaohang Zhang. Fortunately, he goes by Felix. which helps a person who grew up in Mississippi. So Felix is from the 4th Space Warning Squadron. It's one of our 2 missile warning units in Colorado out of Buckley. In addition to being a missile warning pro, Lieutenant Zhang was a distinguished graduate of OTS and the 2nd reservist to go through Space Force's Supra Coder program. So that's where the Space Force is taking young Guardians with skills and taking them through advanced coding training and helping them solve at the tactical level coding problems or help build software-based solutions to contemporary problems inside of space operations. So Felix was one of the first folks to go through the Supra Coder program. Felix came to the unit after working as a propulsion analyst at SpaceX. So he helped build the rockets that I was showing you earlier, and he's now a mechanical engineer at Lockheed Martin. So Felix knows rockets and he knows how to build spacecraft. In addition, Felix is working on his MBA in supply chain and his private pilot's license, as if he doesn't have enough going on in his life. The next person I'll introduce you to is Tech Sergeant Shannon Robertson from the 26th Space Aggressor Squadron. So Shannon is one of our non-prior service members. She did not come to us off of active duty. She joined us straight off civilian life. And she enlisted while she was in college, starting in our Missile Warning Squadron, focusing on the highly elliptical orbit architecture. From there, she moved on to test and is now in the aggressors. But along the way, she basically changed her academic path, and now she is a cybersecurity analyst for Lockheed Martin. And Shannon was, as kind of topping it off for her, she was in the first cohort to go through the Space Test Pilot School in 2020. This is Rich Buckhorn, Staff Sergeant Buckhorn. He's in the other Missile Warning Squadron, 8 Swiss. He is another non-prior service member, and he came to us late in life. He enlisted at age 39 and started his life as a professional musician, but decided that he wanted to serve, and that service has transformed what he does in his professional life. And he is a integration testing. He does software integration testing and verification on the SBIRS missile warning system. And so he's also in a master's program, but this one is space policy. And for the icing on the cake, just a couple of months ago, he used his knowledge of the SBIRS software to lead emerging threat training. As Russia and Ukraine was getting ready to kick off, he led the emergent threat training for his unit. We got no slackers here. I mean, this is just getting, for me, as I read through these, as I asked folks to give me examples, I was just blown away time and again. This is Jared Broderick, and he is at our unit out in California, 9th Combat Operations Squadron out at Vandenberg. 9th Combat Operations Squadron is one of 2 units at the Combined Space Operations Center where all of DoD space operations are controlled. So there's an active duty unit and a reserve unit out there running DoD space operations. In his civilian life, Jared is a space bioscientist at NASA Ames, and that's a fancy way of saying that he conducts research into mitigating the risks to astronaut health, especially during long-duration missions. Most recently, Jared and 3 researchers spent 45 days confined to a 600-square-foot capsule, acting as analog astronauts on a simulated mission to Mars, collecting data related to human health and stress while performing astronaut activities. This is Dennis Woodfork. He is an IMA to Space Delta 1 at the Peter Schriever Garrison. This is when the Space Force was established, they reorganized out of the classic battalions and garrison, or battalions and platoons and squadrons and wings and those types of things. They have what they call deltas, and one of those is the Garrison Delta. So it runs the facilities, the installations of Peterson and Schriever Space Force bases in Colorado Springs, and Dennis is currently acting as the vice commander for that Delta. But in his civilian life, Dennis is a program manager at the Applied Physics Lab out here at Johns Hopkins, working on national security space. Previously to this, he was a division chief at Goddard Space Flight Center, where he worked on guidance, navigation, and control systems on NASA and DoD space systems. Before that, he worked in the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, where he worked on policy issues related to space debris mitigation and removal. And then finally, let me introduce one of our newest officers. This is in one of our IMAs, Second Lieutenant Javier Urze. This is him in his office at Stanford University. And you see the Saturn V rocket standing beside him, and off kind of, you may not be able to see it very well. It's there on your left, your far left side. That is a hyperglide vehicle. So Javier came to the United States from Spain in the early 2000s. He was an engineering research fellow at UC San Diego. And following his postdoc research, he joined Stanford University in 2011 and became a hypersonics researcher and lecturer. In addition, as if you need in addition, he became a lecturer on supercomputing and rocket propulsion. In 2019, Javier enlisted in the reserve, not doing space, but aerial port. He was an aerial porter up at Travis, loading C5s. I found him on LinkedIn. I said, what are you doing, man? Anyways, yeah, so you might ask, why would you enlist and load pallets on a C5 when you're a PhD rocket scientist at Stanford? He wasn't a citizen. So he got his citizenship in 2020 when he was naturalized, and he went through OTS and got commissioned back in April. So he is now Second Lieutenant Urze. He is no longer at Stanford. He's a civil servant at the Rocket Lab at Edwards, running propulsion testing, and he's part of the hypersonics team out at Space Systems Command. So what does all that mean right here, right now, as in today's setting where we are? So as mentioned before, I was a two-time commander inside of this enterprise. I did GPS for a while, and then I was the commander at 310th Space Wing, and have seen the Reserve Space Enterprise grow from its very beginning to where it is today. What matters to me is the role our members play every day in space. So this nation has got a very rich and vibrant history of taking its part-time force, and in our case, they bundled it into a Title 10 reserve, and it has leveraged that Title 10 reserve at the most urgent times of need in this nation's history. And the part-time force is more than just operational surge capacity. It is a strategic treasure. So to me, I'll leave you with the final part, and that is that our part-time force doesn't just operate in space. We build space every day. So with that, I'll be glad to take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
General,
yeah.
In your journey through space, what have you noticed that the space domain initiative has revealed as very different from the existing domains, air, naval, ground, what have you?
So I haven't had much exposure to the Navy or the land component, but growing up in Air Force Reserve, I've got lots of air exposure. And so I'll approach it through that lens. I'll tell you that growing up inside of the Air Force Reserve helped me understand combat the way the rest of the Joint Force understands combat, I think. I did some Air Operations Center time, and so day in and day out, I was kind of a small space guy helping plan. Actually, my very first job in AOC was a F-16 strike planner. And so I'm a space guy. I have no F-16 plan experience at all. Yet, hey man, we need somebody right now. Get over there and plan F-16 strikes. Okay, off you go. And so that helped me understand how to translate, the human kind of condition that we've grown up in, at least in the Air Force and the DoD, and how I could communicate that to my space peers. Specific to the space domain, what is very interesting compared to the others is the fact that I'm having to look at telemetry and make kind of spatial assessments. That not to get too sci-fi geeky on you, but if you remember the movie The Matrix, where they're sitting there looking at all the stuff scroll by and somehow they can see what's going on, it's a little bit like that. not nearly as sci-fi-ish, but that's kind of what you're having to do is look at the telemetry and interpret what's going on. Nowadays, we do have a lot better visualization, particularly when it comes to orbital engagement activities as we're visualizing orbits. When I was growing up as a lieutenant, we were calculating out orbits by hand, and there was a time in my life where I could look at the orbital element sets, and I could kind of construct in my head what was going on. It would take me a few seconds, but nowadays we've got the software tools that are helping our guardians and airmen do that with a lot greater precision. So I hope that answers the question.
Hey, sir, Kevin Humphrey. Just a quick question. So, on the 1,400 reservists, have you asked them kind of how they want this to go down with the 10 component or the reserves that kind of got their input? I'm just curious of where they stand.
Yeah. So I've had a handful of conversations with airmen. The thing that I think I can speak for most of them is the uncertainty is the thing that's most bothersome. More than anything else, it's not. Hey, is it going to be this flavor of reserve or this flavor of Space Force or this flavor? It's the uncertainty. So when you're working side by side, and I'll use 3/10 because that's the missions that I know best. All of our units are total force associations where we're working side by side with our reserve or active duty friends in their operation centers. It has been tough to stay motivated sometimes when your active duty friend got to go join the Space Force and got to go make a big deal about applying for the Space Force and going and doing that. And meanwhile, you're having to sit back and wait for deliberations to be deliberated. So that's not to say that deliberations are bad in any way. I don't want to leave anybody with that impression. But the uncertainty is the thing that's being the most aggravated to the airmen. So hopefully we'll have some of that uncertainty cleared up in short order. Yes, sir.
So there's a deadline, or is there a deadline for the transfer of the reserves from Air Force to Space Force? Is that based on the budget and the funding? And if so, when that deadline comes and goes, what's going to happen to the reserve units then if they don't have the funding?
Yeah. So the short answer to your question is right now there is no deadline right now because there has been no enabling legislation on anything. So the real answer to the question is it depends on how Congress chooses to act or not act on the proposal that we were briefed on just a moment ago. So I know that's probably not a very satisfying answer, but that's the technical truth is that until decisions are made, we will keep going the way that we're going. And once a decision is made, the deadlines will all be spelled out in that enabling decision. Does that help? Thank you, everybody.
Global Space University Covenant sticker. And actually what I want to do is on behalf of General Phillips, I would like to present you also with a ROA coin. So thank you, General. Centennial coin.
Thanks.
Where did you? Thank you, General Feltman. I really do appreciate your perspective. I think most people appreciate the opportunity to be educated on the important and critical mission that the reserve component has been supporting for the space superiority mission for decades. I'd like to now introduce another reservist who has been doing the reserve business for quite some time. Lieutenant Colonel Jeremy D. Newts is the officer in charge of Air Force Reserve congressional issues and initiatives where he supports the Chief of Air Force Reserve in reporting to the U.S. Congress, the Air Force Reserve Program budget and legislative agenda. Also, Lieutenant Colonel Newts was a prior commander of the 26th Space Aggressor Squadron. Once an aggressor? Always an aggressor. Come on up here, sir. welcome. Please help me welcoming Lieutenant Colonel Newts to the stage.
Yeah, that picture's up there. Afternoon, everybody. As Mr. Wolf, Colonel Wolf, hippie, I really don't know how to refer to you these days. Said, my name is Jeremy Newts. Work for the on the reserve side, congressional integration, congressional initiatives to make sure that any new legislation or legislation that has been passed is working correctly, and if there are changes that we need, we will advocate to Congress and also help them write some of those initiatives to better implement what was intended. Because as was pointed out by Ms. Lucas earlier, best of intentions when writing legislation doesn't always work out in execution. So we have to fix it as we go along. As was said, I am a 21-year space professional. Of those 21 years, the last 7 have been as a reservist. I've worked in a couple of different squadrons, 8 Swiss and the 26 SAS. So I have seen. My presentation today is how part-time personnel have been used or are being used by Space Force in different methods. There are a couple of different ways that the unit organization works, and then the individual mobilization augmentees are a different. I don't want to say a different beast, but they are individuals and used as their organizations see fit. So with that, move on to the slideshow. Oh. I'm driving. Who knew? No. I did. That's okay. We can move on without slides. They were really just kind of a couple of pretty pictures. What I wanted to point out, and General Feltman already kind of showed it, there are 2 main operating locations for our reserve units in Air Force Reserve. Colorado Springs and Aurora, Colorado, along the Front Range of Colorado, and the other main location being out in Vandenberg in California. Of those, they're separated into primarily the 2 field commands, Space Operations Command, which are all the operational squadrons supporting missile warning, space-based missile warning, electronic warfare, and 9COS doing space domain awareness. And the other side is Space Train and Readiness Command, doing all of the training, education, which is where I hung out. Actually, I hung out in both. I was at 8 Swiss for a while, and then, like I said, and then 26 SAS as the DO and the commander. The operational units, the part-timers there are mobilized in an analogous way to how most air squadrons, all flying squadrons, are mobilized in a deployment-like fashion, but as opposed to under a construct called Space Mission Force. So like a 4 to 6 month long deployment on orders to support the 24/7 operational mission that their active duty unit is. Hey, there we go. Okay. To support the 24/7 operational unit that their active duty unit is assigned. So specifically, like with 8 Swiss and 4 Swiss up there, they will come on, like I said, for those 4 to 6 months in a rotational pattern. for some of the deployable units like the 428 space, which is a very, very brand new unit supporting the 4th Electronic Warfare Squadron, counter communication systems, offensive space control, and the 16th space or the 380th Space Control Squadron on the defensive side. Those are traditional deployments, actually going overseas to support austere locations. But the same concept applies in that they are on long-term orders to support steady state operations. On the flip side, when it comes to those units that are in Space Training and Readiness Command or support Space Training and Readiness Command, this is, you could consider it more of a surge type capacity. So with the 42nd CTS supporting classes that are coming through the National Space Security Institute, and surging instructors, developing courseware or being teachers for those courses that they're experts on. When it comes to the aggressors, so the 26th and the 379th, both those squadrons support a lot of combatant command exercises, a lot of Space Force exercises, and day to day, the squadrons don't need those numbers, the numbers of the part-time personnel that we have up there. We don't need them there planning every day. There frankly is just not enough work for me as an aggressor commander to have 89 people in the office every day. They would be really, really bored and painting a lot of rocks. So we are fortunate in that we can have those members be part-time personnel, have a great civilian job, but when we are supporting a space flag or a global lightning or a Pacific Rim exercise, we are able to coordinate with their civilian employees to get the time off to bring them on for a couple of weeks so that we can actually get out there and do a full support to actually operate the equipment. And the same thing applies to the 379th Range Squadron. We require, as aggressors, we require them to do range safety. But it's the same concept. They have a handful of planners in the back shop with their active duty component that are planning and making sure that all of the logistics are in place. And then when time comes to actually execute the exercise, that's only about 2 weeks. We bring the part-timers on for those 2 weeks and go out. They generally they love the TDY to Hawaii to support, but it's allows them to continue their civilian job with limited interruption. And the same thing applies to the 14th Test Squadron. The test planning is all done back shop over the courses of weeks. When the test execution happens, same concept. Surge a bunch of people that are experts that are bringing in outside expertise, from their job at Lockheed or SpaceX or L3, and they're able to add and kind of advance the test in ways that daily the military members don't necessarily have the outside expertise to bring. This next one is just putting into numbers what I said. So over the course of a year, there are about 57 full-time equivalents. I need to check my own slides. And those full-time equivalents, like I said, are broken up into either that SMF support, which is the in-place deployment or sometimes overseas deployment, or those surge operations that the STARCOM members participate in. There are additional support provided by our AGRs, our full-time members, who technically, as it says, are not supposed to materially contribute to execution of operations. That being said, the purpose of the AGR is to train the part-time members. So inherently, they have to go out on these exercises and learn. So we are able to, we will double dip a little bit on that and use their full-time status that, as they're being paid as a reservist to gain expertise so that when we bring in our part-time members, they have the most up-to-date information. It's not just something that the AGR learned 4 years ago on one exercise and has just been perpetuating throughout. They are constantly refreshing all of their information as well. Additionally with that, there is overhead. Inherently, there is overhead to support those members. So the 310 Space Wing staff, the OSS, to maintain continuity, maintain evaluations and standards. We have those personnel. But again, those personnel are not, they're not just back office people. Like they are also certified in systems. So they're out there on the floor as well, making sure that they're contributing to the mission in the same fashion. And then the next one, as I said, so we have from a unit standpoint, the two ways that our part-time members contribute are, the 24/7 ops, so the 4 to 6 month deployments, and most of those are on the spot, like I said, the SPOC side, or the surge operations on the STARCOM side. The third way is the IMAs, and those IMAs are varied, as General Feltman showed up or posted, some of them down in Cape Canaveral, some of them in DC, some of them at headquarters. They are spread around the nation in various roles, and how they are used also varies greatly. Some of them are brought in specifically because of their expertise that General Feltman pointed out. Additionally, we have some executives at Lockheed that are working also with SPOC on the talent management aspect, bringing their knowledge from public industry or private industry into the talent management of members to the Space Force and developing that. And the last thing on there, the IMA and MA support. These are hand-selected members that are basically, for all intents and purposes, reserve right-hand personnel to step in if that leader is out. So a Delta leader, which is now the Space Force equivalent to a wing. If the Delta leader is out, they generally have an IMA that they have talked with, they have groomed, they have prepared to step in for, say, the 2 weeks of vacation or like the extended leave that they may have gone on, allow for a seamless transition of that IMA to step into the role and help out in the time of that leader's absence. Same thing with the mobilization assistance on the GO side. What General Feltman does, what General Keegan Murphy does, what General Olson does to General Raymond, is not only be a reserve ear, but also to fill in as necessary when they are out of pocket. And that is actually all I have regarding the way that currently we are supporting from an Air Force Reserve side to the Space Force. I will open it for questions.
Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. Just a quick acronyms.
Yeah.
What is SPOC?
Space Operations Command.
Okay, I thought that might be it. But you do understand, I mean, Spock, Starcom, did you guys think of this? Yeah.
I was not a part of those discussions. I just saw them released on Twitter, and yep.
It's almost like somebody read a script somewhere.
Over here. Loretta Green with Space Force Association. I'm just wondering, in terms of COVID and with hybrid work environments, how much did that impact for reservists to have part-time jobs? Like, did that help corporations to maybe become more flexible and relaxed because they had to, they already were having hybrid situations?
Yeah.
Does that help?
So I will say, and I am, absolutely speaking only from my experience as commander of the aggressors at the time, we were lucky in that we were set up as a very high tempo out the door squadron. We were supporting exercise all the time. So most of my people were used to remote ops already. We parlayed that into, as opposed to having our part-timers come in for our UTA weekends, if it was, say, like a heavy, like a computer-based training weekend, we would let our members just stay home, especially if they were out of town, and get, just to effectively telework, for a UTA. So I say that to say that, yes, we were able to parlay it, and I know that a lot of my members that, have those, are teleworking, have been able to expand their flexibility with their job, that allows them, I can actually put them on orders more often, that will allow them to, again, almost double dip in that, they're able to, in the morning, telework at their normal job, and if they want to continue to telework for their reserve job in the afternoon.
Quick question for you. As an aggressor commander, did you have any members on your team you deliberately sought after that could do artificial intelligence or machine learning or the data scientist set to kind of offset American advantages in technology over?
So we had not gotten to that point when I was there. We were mostly because we were concentrating on growing our OW, our orbital warfare side, because we were primarily up until about 2020, primarily an electronic warfare squadron. And we were expanding into orbital warfare just as the Space Force was expanding into orbital warfare. So while we did not go for AI, I do have members that their day job is with Lockheed and with Northrop doing their commercial orbital warfare stuff. So it is absolutely something that we would engage with, but it wasn't something that I did at the time.
Thank you, Colonel. Great comments. One of the items that occupies a reservist's mind may be the accumulation of at least 50 points a year. So how is that done with y'all, these IMAs?
Any number of ways. Like I said, if we do a telework UTA, they're accumulating points just like they normally would if they came into the office. So quite frankly, the expansion of telework due to COVID has been a boon to make sure that people are much more easily able to get to their points. Because I don't have to, if they're out of town, I don't have to bring them into the office to work, especially if it's, hey, I need you to do an unclassified lesson plan for electronic warfare waveforms. So it is something that we were actually able to leverage very, very easily. And I know we were not alone in that. I know it's an anecdote for me, but I also know from other squadron commanders, not just within space units, but across the reserve, that we're able to leverage that. Additionally, I know Congress did pass a law relieving the requirement for 50 points when a national emergency has been declared. So for COVID, members got a reprieve from that as well. Yep.
Are you guys looking at keeping some of those COVID-related policies in place to allow for greater flexibility? For instance, like coming from industry, we have a lot of the same capabilities in terms of networks and things, using those places that these people work to allow them to telework, especially in like classified environments where it's not as easily or more readily available.
Yeah,
So,
that is very much office place dependent. For REI, for my office specifically, we're about 75% telework, 25% in the office still. And that seems to be a general theme. Again, this is stories that I've heard, but it seems to be a general theme across the Pentagon. I mean, if you go in the halls today, it is way quieter than it had been, even though all restrictions have been lifted.
So which, in the case, in the case of like where different folks are actually working in the industry or in a specific area in industry that they're actually doing their reserve units are they looking at ways to allow that to kind of, I don't want to say double count, this is the word, but as if they're doing that in their day job and then they have to do it in their reservist job, are they getting that same credit for that because they're already more proficient versus having to bring that person in for all those days just to learn what they're already doing?
So currently, no, but I can't say that it's completely dismissed. So if I have somebody that is working, if I know of somebody that like one of my members was working with Northrop on an orbital platform, I was not going to put them through basic orbitology 101. I was not going to force them to suffer through that. I do know that Space Force is working towards that kind of credit for members, regardless of status, regardless of whether or not they're full-time or part-time. But that is, I know that they're doing it. I do not know any details of it, though. All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Colonel Lewis. Sir. Again, for you, sticker for Global Space University, and for General Phillips, on behalf of General Phillips and ROA, Centennial Coin.
Thank you,
ROA
sir.
Coin. Thanks so much for being here today.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate your perspective.
Oh, that's yours.
Yeah. Thanks again. Let me introduce Colonel Kevin Humphrey, goes by Hump, to the stage. Hump's going to do a special introduction for Colonel Stanley. Hump, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you again for SFA and RA for doing this. This is needed. I can tell you that because I've been doing this for a long time. I came back in 19. Actually, General Gale, hope I don't steal any of his thunder, but he brought me on back from National Guard and put me on orders to just kind of be on the planned task force for the Space Force and kind of run alongside. And we've been trying to do a reserve component since day one. We tried to do it at the same time as the Space Force has stood up. But as you can see, here we are 3 years later, and we're still fighting that fight. So I just want to kind of give you a scene setter, because I think probably in the room I've been following this path the longest. Other than General Gale, he's probably been the longest, this path, and just kind of give you a scene setter on the National Guard and kind of where we are. And then I'm going to introduce Tim here real quick and let him give you his piece of it. So first, L3 Harris, got to say thank you to L3. Good story here, 114th Florida Air National Guard. I'm a Florida National Guardsman. That's where I'm currently at, the Joint Force Headquarters. We have 6 L3 Harris employees that are part of the Florida Air National Guard Squadron. They're an electromagnetic warfare squadron. The CCS 10.2 is their system that they operate. L3 Harris makes that system, and actually 2 of our guys will be deploying here October 1. 2 of your guys are deploying October 1. So we thank you for supporting these guys to work for you, but also to the system they build, they're going to deploy with and operate in theater. That's just a great story, no matter how you look at it. The second great story I want to share with you is you probably read the newspaper article. National Guardsman is in Washington, is sitting at home one day on a weekend, cell phone rings, and there's a Ukrainian military member on the other end of the cell phone. He's sitting, being pinned down by a tank with this, they didn't say what it was, they said it's an anti-tank system, I'm assuming it's a Javelin, and it's malfunctioned. So he calls on his cell phone, probably WhatsApp, to a Washington Guardsman and says, dude, it's not working. He's pinned down. They go through a set of reset procedures, got the thing to work, takes out the tank. He sends a picture of a smoking Russian tank to the Washington Guardsman at home. That is why we're here. That's why we need a reserve component to the Space Force. That's a current story. Go Google it. You'll see it in the news. I love that story. I heard it told many times. So when you look at where we are and where we're headed, we need to get this right. We just do. It's time to get it right. I can tell you I am currently a Title X Guardsman, which means I cannot tell you what I support. I'm not allowed to give you my opinion, my best military advice. I support the administration position, which if you saw last year, they were against the Space National Guard. But I can tell you I'm going to introduce someone who can, if you understand the Guard. We have Title X, we have Title 32. So today, with me, I have a traditional DSG, drill status guardsman. DSG means part-timer, and he is in Title 32 status, and he is the commander. I'm going to read you who he's in command of here. He is a commander of the Triple Deuce, the 222 Command and Control Squadron. Is an Air National Guard squadron that provides the National Reconnaissance Office, NRO, Operations Center, the NOC, with surge and contingency support to assist in the operations, protection, and defense of national security space systems. Additionally, the Triple Deuce CACs executes space battle management of the NRO enterprise, providing operational command and control, orbital analysis, and exploitation enterprise status reporting, and coordination of NRO space operations across the DoD and intelligence community. So before I do that, one more thing I wanted to share with you. I was at a conference last week with U.S. Spacecom, and Admiral Bernanke received the outbrief of Spacecom. If you know Spacecom, they're a new combatant command. We provide warfighters to combatant commands, and they're trying to get it right as well. They're brand new, but they know international partners is critical to how they do their mission, and they're using the state partnership program. That's like their main priority unit leverage, force leverage, force multiplier they're using to expand their international partners. And this is from General Dickinson and Admiral Bernanke. And then last thing I want to say is, if you've been watching the posture season, what have you heard from Secretary Kendall, General Raymond, General Dickinson? All three during their hearings have said, I cannot do the mission without the Guard. So with that, I'm going to give you Colonel Tim Stanley from the Triple Deuce, both in New York and here in Chantilly, Virginia. It's all yours.
I didn't come prepared with slides, and when I saw but when I saw that there were slides being had, I called my deputy and I said, Frank, the reserve guys, they got slides. You got to send me something. I got to have something I can show. So I do have one slide. So I'm like, I just couldn't could not have one slide anyway. So anyway, good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Wolf, members of the board, and the Space Force Association, and the Reserve Officers of America for inviting me to speak with you today on the National Guard's role in support of the United States Space Force. I'm Colonel Tim Stanley, commander of the 222nd Command and Control Squadron in the New York Air National Guard. And as Kevin mentioned, I am a part-timer. So I'd like to add that disclaimer that I am a guardsman on Title 32 status. It's important for me to point that out because guardsmen in Title 10 active duty status are required to support the administration's position. This does not apply to me, which is why I'm here today to share with you the necessity of establishing a Space National Guard. America's operational reserve requires combat depth in all domains, and that includes space. The conversation about the need for a reserve component for the Space Force is critical, as well as recognize the value the multipliers bring in light of the expanding capacity. And that is the Space National Guard. We are the force multiplier. Today's complex and evolving security environment requires greater reliance on the National Guard as a cost-effective, dual-role force, providing operational depth to the Army, Air Force, and Space Force. As our national security and homeland defense increasingly rely on space, the National Guard remains an integral part of the joint force. Presently, the National Guard is performing vital space missions as it has been for the past 27 years. The space mission operates in 14 units across 7 states: Alaska, California, Colorado, Florida, Hawaii, New York, Ohio, and the territory of Guam, with guardsmen making up 15% of the Department of the Air Force's space professionals. And as you can see here on the slide, this is where we have the representation of space units across the U.S. I'd like to share a few data points with you. The Space Force continues to rely on these proven and critical unit-equipped capabilities. This is evident through the rotational space electromagnetic warfare deployments, where our 3 space control squadrons have continuously deployed since 2009 in support of operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, providing 60% of the Space Force's SEW capability. The National Guard provides 25% of the national missile warning and space domain awareness capability in support of Homeland Defense, with 24/7/365 in-place missile warning and satellite command and control. By providing steady state and surge capacity, the National Guard delivers full spectrum space intelligence and provides the only backup capability that protects satellite communications for National Command Authority and National Command, Control, and Communications. Finally, the National Guard operates the only survivable and endurable mobile missile warning and nuclear detonation detection capability. Every single day, National Guard space units defend our nation on behalf of the U.S. Space Command and combatant commanders. The U.S. Space Force cannot execute missions today without this operational capability. I share these statistics with you to highlight the National Guard has been conducting and continues to conduct and execute space missions, but has been doing so despite being orphaned since the Space Force was established by law in the 2020 NDAA. Today, National Guard Space Forces are in an untenable posture in the Air National Guard, misaligned to and dependent on the Air Force, a service no longer performing space missions. This misalignment has resulted in increased bureaucracy, severed standards and training, lack of unified command and control, and will ultimately degrade readiness at a time when our nation is looking to increase its space capabilities. Simply put, this is not sustainable. Establishing Space National Guard ensures uninterrupted access to crucial space operations capacity, creating a seamless relationship between us and its parent service, the Space Force. Today's Air National Guard space units, missions, and organizational structure could seamlessly transfer to Space National Guard, properly aligning as the reserve component of the Space Force. There's been a lot of debate about what is the cost of to establish the Space National Guard. Our NGB Space Operations staff has concluded the analysis and has shared it with General Hokanson, the Chief of the National Guard Bureau, that the one-time cost to establish the Space National Guard is about $240,000. Using already programmed NGB resources, this will cover Space National Guard heraldry items, uniform items, and unit signage. So let me foot stomp that. NGB Space Operations staff has conducted the analysis, and General Hokanson, the Chief of the Staff, has explained that a one-time cost of approximately $240,000 and using NGB programmed resources will cover the new Space National Guard heraldry items, uniform items, and unit signage. The reality is the proposed model for a Space National Guard unit, there would be no growth and no cost. Rather, existing Air Guard space units would simply transfer to a Space Guard. This zero balance transfer would continue to fund existing Guard space missions at current levels to meet Space Force mission requirements. Similar to how DoD moved personnel appropriations from the Air Force to the Space Force, current programmed Air Guard space appropriations and end strength would simply transfer to new Space Guard appropriations and end strength. In the same manner in which the Air Force provides the Space Force with installation support, base support for Space National Guard units would be provided by the Air National Guard. Therefore, establishing a Space National Guard requires no additional funding, and to include no additional MILCON. Again, establishing a Space National Guard requires no additional funding, including no additional MILCON, military construction, sorry. The value proposition of the National Guard lies with a predominantly part-time force structure. 20% of the joint force at 4% of the DoD budget. Approximately 2/3 of space professionals in the Guard are part-time, costing less than 1/3 of the active component member when in a part-time status. Furthermore, 45% of the part-time space professionals have full-time positions in the aerospace industry, providing invaluable reach into communities and to connecting with local industry. This unique flexibility is critical in meeting national security postures. Establishing a Space Force ensures uninterrupted access to crucial space operations capacity, creating a seamless relationship with its parent service, the Space Force. Last year, Congress drafted fully sufficient language to establish the Space National Guard in the House version of the NDAA for fiscal year 2022. This year, Senators Feinstein and Rubio have also introduced a bill, the Space National Guard Establishment Act. If this fully sufficient language was enabled in law in the 2023 NDAA, a Space National Guard would operate as a reserve component in the U.S. Space Force, mirroring existing Air and Army National Guard authorities. A Space National Guard remains the most cost-effective and efficient option for the Space Force to manage and maximize capability and capacity. One other thing I'd like to mention is the state partnership program, which is crucial to the Air National Guard. We've got alignment. Every state in the union has alignment with another country to help with the knowledge and the enablement of military capabilities within another foreign country. New York State, my state, happens to be aligned with Brazil. And last year at the Space Symposium, we met with Brazil, and they talked about the alignment with New York and wanting to understand how we did things with RPAs, space, AOC, and we had a great conversation with them. And this was last year's Space Symposium. We didn't do anything with the introduction. We just we did a meet and greet with a couple of the two-star generals from Brazil. It was a great meeting. It was a great introduction. And a year went by with no activity at all between Brazil and New York on any front. This year, this past Space Symposium, the same generals came to Space Symposium, and we met, and they said, we'd really like to have New York come down and help us with space and RPAs and AOC, and see what we do in Brazil, and how you can help us with maturing the program. And they didn't come right out and say it, but they inferred that if we weren't going to be serious about helping them, that they were going to have to turn to others to help them. And the others was inferred would be Russia and China to help them mature their programs. So right after Space Symposium was over, I sent 3 of my space operators down to Brazil to kind of walk through what they've currently established in launch and space domain awareness and SSA, et cetera, space situational awareness. They were supposed to go down for 5 days. They were asked to stay another 3 days to go see another part of what they did for space. It was such a huge hit with their program. I sent 2 officers and 1 enlisted person down there. It was such a huge hit with them. They did an immediate follow-up with a 4-star and a 3-star to New York to go through all of New York's capabilities. I spent a week with these generals from Saturday to Sunday, escorting them around New York, looking at how we do space battle management, how we do space domain awareness, how we do space situation awareness, what we do for RPAs, what we do for the AOC, and they were just completely overwhelmed with what capabilities we had just in New York State as an Air National Guard, and what we were willing to help them with in the months and years to come. So as a follow-up, they met with our TAG, and the TAG simply said, where can we help, and what's most important to you guys? The number one thing, hands down, was space. Come teach us how to do space battle management. Come teach us how to do SDA, space domain awareness. Teach us how to do space situational awareness. We're so new at this, we need your help. So we've got them planned to be a part of some joint exercises. We've got them planned to be a part of the joint commercial JCO, joint commercial operations they're going to participate in. We're going to be participating in one of their exercises here at the end of October. So we've gone from a year ago doing nothing with these guys to all of a sudden being fully engaged and involved in how they're developing and evolving their space programs. So it's come full circle, 100 miles an hour, and where and how we're helping them. Second importance to them was RPAs and AOC, and how, not necessarily how that they can operate or maintain or create their own RPA mission, but how space can help them in RPA, how space can help their AOC mission. So it was quite an eye-opening experience for me personally to spend that week with them, but for them to understand how we could help them with what they're doing in space. So that said, I thank you for your time today, and I look forward to fielding any of your questions that you have.
Well, anyway, sir, I got a pretty loud voice.
I can hear you.
I'm a late comer here, but it sounds to me like this costs basically decimal dust to create. Air Force is picking up the rest of the bill, providing the bodies. In your conversations with NGB, you get a sense of perhaps the support you're getting from the governors on something like this? I mean, I'm wondering what the pushback is.
Yeah, great question. So I know that there's been a letter that was signed by all 50 governors that was sent to the president in support of a Space National Guard. Kevin, is that
Actually, it was 54 tags.
tags? Sorry, tags. Sent to the.
That's the generals of free state. They have a 2-star in charge. Plus the 4. But the governors have not engaged.
Can I make an educated guess that this is a turf battle? And you've got the Guard wanting to get into a domain that perhaps others would like to exclude it from.
Yes.
Okay, fine.
Well, I think that's you got to be careful. The Guard's been in this domain for 25 years. Since 1995, they have had established Air National Guard bases and units. And so I think that this is a mission set that's not new. I mean, it's grown slowly but surely over time since 1995 to now 14 different units in 7 states and 1 territory. And I think that the cost, as you mentioned, is when I left the Pentagon, the Air Force was paying about $80 million a year for all of the space capability provided by the Air National Guard. When CBO did the study, right now they say it would cost $600 million to stand up a Space National Guard. The range, they say, is $100 million $600 million. They took our $80 million and they said, "Oh no, you're going to have a $20 million headquarters building." There's $100 million, and then they prognosticated guard units in every state and added generals in every state, all of which is hogwash. Not that it might not grow over time; it might grow, and if it does grow, it'll cost more money. But to transfer what they have now in the National Guard into the Space National Guard is a zero-based transfer and an administrative cost of, I guess, $240,000, which the Guard Bureau says it has.
Do you think you can get that number down, General?
So when you said a territorial thing, turf. Yeah, so I interpret that there are some antibodies in OMB that are not supportive of standing up another guard or another guard component.
I was thinking more within the Pentagon, but okay.
I don't think there's any antibodies in the Pentagon.
Okay. So a question. Commend you, by the way, on saving Brazil-American relations with your exportation of a couple of folks down there. Good move. My question was, nation being an independent nation, Brazil being an independent nation state, and as far as I know, New York not being one yet, where was the United States of America in this very important initiative to keep Brazil with us?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. That's way above my pay grade.
It's part of the Guard Association program, yes.
So the State Partnership Program is a DoD program that's administered by the National Guard. Okay?
So there's a process through which ultimately the Secretary of Defense approves the partnership between Brazil was the state and New York was chosen as its partner. But all of the activities done with their states, they're all approved through the appropriate levels inside OSD. That this is not New York going and doing New York stuff with Brazil. This is stuff for the Space Force, Air Force, and their relationship with the militaries inside the other state. There's how many total partnerships now? I have forgotten. Somewhere around 80 some. But this is not a state program. It is a DoD program that's administered with the states. And Ukraine is a good example. I mean, Ukraine had continuous presence of the California National Guard since 1993, helping them train in Western Ukraine. And that there was so much training going on that their partner couldn't do it all. Florida National Guard was there actually just before the war broke out, and they left. But I mean, this is a DoD program run by the Guard.
I'll tell you. So Colombia and Chile have gotten in line and want the same conversation to have with New York. And we also have we've also been assigned South Africa, but they're just not as advanced as Brazil. And Brazil has actually gotten to the point where they want to fund putting two of my people in Brazil for 2-year tours.
So you would say that you went as an emissary of the federal government?
DoD for sure. Yes.
Yeah, so part of my ignorance, but does Brazil have space assets?
They do.
I mean, how widespread does every country have space assets?
They've got some minimal launch capabilities, and they have some. They've got a couple. They've got one bird up in Leo right now, and they're about to put up another one to do some comms, satellite comms. But they want to do a lot more. They want to do a lot. They want to get so this part of the getting them involved in some of these exercises and getting them involved in some of the JCO operations as well. So yeah, they want to get a lot more aggressive in space. Anything else?
I have a question. What would you like from ROA?
Well, I think what I would like would be to get some of our senators on the SASC in line with the objective to create a Space National Guard. That's been especially the New York senator. It's been a tough nut to crack. We've got senators that are not on the SASC in line with support. I think we have 17. How many? 11? 13. So we've got several of them that are not on the SASC, But getting those senators on the SASC to be supportive of a National Guard, a Space National Guard, would be Christmas. Did I say that right, Kevin?
Quick question.
I can hear you.
I was okay. There it is. I gotta keep my. So seeing a lot of pressure since working in the industry, work with the guardsmen a lot. And we talked about some of the capabilities. Seeing a lot of pressure to keep things focused on multi-domain versus just space, because a large component obviously is the air part, and you have to bring in that other component to be able to access the different funding. So I guess my question is, moving forward, if they do not create the Space Guard, what's the biggest takeaway or biggest negative if it doesn't happen? What do you think?
If they don't create a Space National Guard, what's the biggest negative?
Right.
You saw 14 units up there in the missions that they do. Those aren't going to have a home, because the Air National Guard is not going to, in my opinion, this Air National Guard is not going to continue to fund that bill. Sure. Right, so those 14 missions, which I can't speak for I can't speak for 13 of them. I can speak to one of them, and the mission that we do to support the intelligence community out of the NRO. It's a big lift. And what we do on a daily basis for the intelligence community, they could not continue to do without us. Even though we're there in this environment, we're there for surge and contingency, they couldn't do without us. So you could say that same thing about all of the 13 missions, especially those up in Alaska and California, and that's going to be the biggest hurdle for the space, because they can't do what they do today, let alone pick up 13, 14 other missions.
Especially in EW, you guys have more guards units than you have active units.
Right.
There's more
60% of it.
guards in doing that mission than there are active folks.
Right.
So that's a significant.
Yeah, there's about 1,100. There's about 1,100 space professionals in the Air National Guard.
Out of those 1,100 space professionals, there's a rumor going around that if the Space Force Guard isn't established by the end of September, then to your point, all those missions in that are not going to be funded by Air National Guard. Is that true, or?
Yeah,
or
so
not?
I don't know about the time frame. I think the time frame is suspect. But to unwind all those missions is going to take more than between now and September. I think that if we're not funded, if there's not a Space National Guard, it'll take a couple of years to unwind all that stuff. In my opinion, Kevin, would you? Yeah.
We have an online question for you.
Oh, okay.
Is there a work model for individual contractors based on skills?
Is there a work model for individual contractors based on skills? So I've got, in my unit, there's only 80 people. It's 80 people strong, of which only 11 of them are full-timers. So the rest of them are contractors. The rest of them are working in the aerospace industry. So they come back and are part of the unit one weekend a month. Is that the question, or is it the question to contractors as part of the Space National Guard, Air National Guard?
I'm not sure because it was online.
So either way, we've got a large portion of my unit is space professionals that work in the industry. I'd say probably of the other 69 people, probably 55 or 60 of them work in the aerospace industry, right? So they're contractors in the aerospace industry. I don't employ any contractors in my unit as part of the unit itself, but I'm sure there are others throughout the other 13 units. Anything else? All right, well, thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Stanley. I want to give you this. Dulles Space University, on behalf of General Phillips at ROA, and Centennial Coin for ROA.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Colonel Stanley.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I think we're going to take a quick 5-minute break, 10-minute break. Brad, is that correct, while we set up for the industry panel? Then we've got an industry panel next to hear their perspective on the importance of the reserve component in support of their mission set. And then we'll conclude with comments from General Engel. So please, let's just take a quick 10-minute break and then back in seats for our industry panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Brad Carlson. I am the CEO of Military Nonprofit Consulting in support of ROA and SFA. We've pulled together kind of our last session here today, a different perspective. We've heard a lot from the Air Force, the National Guard, the Space Force about various options for what a Space Force Reserve component might look like. And we thought it would be appropriate to kind of bring together here a panel to talk about, from the corporate sector, what does this all mean? As we talk about, before the Space Force, our citizen soldiers, our citizen warriors, and those serving in the Reserve and the Guard, and the fact that they have both a dual career. They have both their military career and their civilian career. And how does that impact readiness? With ROA, we talk a lot about the triad of readiness being militarily ready, civilian ready, meaning a good paying career civilian job, and of course family readiness. So as the Space Force approaches these questions about structure, et cetera, we also need to take into account how this looks from a corporate perspective. And so we pulled together a great panel for you here this afternoon. First is Alicia Grady. Alicia is the director of the Army Reserve Private-Public Partnership Office. I like to say it's the workforce development arm of the Army Reserve. And Alicia, welcome. We also have Brigadier General Scott Bethel, founder and CEO of Integrity ISR. And General's going to help us today talk about the training aspects in relationship between the private sector and the Space Force. And then last but not least, Army Reserve Josh Eccles, who is the Military Talent Acquisition Manager for Raytheon Intelligence and Space. Welcome, Josh. Kind of kick things off, this will be, again, a Q&A session. But Alicia, as you, in your role with the Army Reserve and the kind of the Workforce Development Office, what advice would you give to your potential counterpart, regardless of what the structure is for Space Force from a Reserve component standpoint, and some of the lessons learned and the challenges you're facing on the Army Reserve side of the house?
Okay, thanks, Brad. And thanks, everybody, for this session today. So the Private-Public Partnership Office is the conduit between the Army Reserve and corporate America, if you will. And so my job is to engage with employer partners. What I do is I actually interview them. When companies want to partner with the Army Reserve, I do a telephonic or a Teams or an in-person interview where and when appropriate, and talk to them about what my boss, Lieutenant General Daniels, goals and objectives are for the Army Reserve. And her two primary goals are recruitment and retention, as in any military force, right? Recruiting and retaining. And then talking to that employer and how can we align our goals and objectives with you as a company and your goals and objectives, because they're probably the same, recruiting talent and retaining talent. And then talking about how can we match and line those up with the military skills that we bring to the table, but then what that corporate partner needs in their talent pool. One of the things I think is really important is when I have these conversations, a lot of businesses are very veteran focused in their hiring. And that's good. We want our companies to hire veterans. But then I open up that conversation and I say, but I want you to hire our currently serving soldiers. And there's always a pause because a lot of companies don't understand, like Brad said, about those dual career citizens. So we have our reserve soldiers that are currently serving 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year, but they need a good career path as well. And so that opens up a whole different, conversation, and it takes a different path. And I think we're at a point where there's a lot of re-education happening now with employers, especially when it comes to what does it look like if I were to hire an Army reservist, how long will they be gone? What does that mean to me? And of course, we always talk about ESGR, the Employer Support for Guard and Reserve, and what that means. But it really, for me is having a conversation and then talking to that company and what do they need in terms of talent, and then me going back to our units and our commands and saying, okay, where do we have the talent, and target market rather than just push things out to the masses and say, I have hundreds of employer partners. Okay, that's great. But this particular company needs this particular skill set. And so I'm going to go to those areas where I know we in the Army Reserve have that skill set and match them up that way. Where it's important for us to have a lot of remote opportunities, say in like the Asia Pacific Islands. We need remote opportunities there because there's not a lot of brick and mortar type companies. So how do we cater then to the market that's there? And so that's the approach that we're taking, but it really is having the conversation and just really talking about how do we mutually support one another in this process of getting our soldiers into good career paths.
Thank you, Alicia. Scott, as you handle the kind of the training between the serving member and the corporations in space with Integrity ISR, can you talk about your program and how it's focused to make that gap?
Absolutely. And let me just say thanks a lot to the ROA and to L3 for letting us be here today. It's really fantastic. And the speakers so far have been really informative and kind of helped shape the battle space. So I'll tell you that our research indicates that about 65% of the people that are transitioning into Space Force right now have zero formal space training. We were talking briefly at the break. There are, a great many, of course, that were already space guys and moved across. But now there's an opportunity for immense amount of growth. Then the second thing is that there's almost no light between industry space and government space. Because the basics are you're launching an object into the upper atmosphere, and whether that's going to be used for a Department of Defense purpose or for a communications purpose or for a weather purpose or a million other reasons, all that is really important. So in an effort to give engineers and logisticians and acquirers and so forth that kind of skill set, you got to do things that are more 2022 than they were 1985 when I came in, and in 1965 when General Lingell came into the military, roughly, round figures, that are not involving abacuses and chalkboards. And so as we think about training in this environment, you got to come to it with a couple of different important parts. One, you got to be adaptable and you got to be flexible. So not every person requires exactly the same training and exactly the same skill set. Two, you have to understand that the modern learner is not necessarily going to sit through a classroom and 846 PowerPoint slides, take a quiz at the end, give them a certificate, and call them trained. And so as we look at that in Integrity ISR, we think in terms of what is the requirement and how do we meet that requirement. And Alicia talked about how to bring the Army along and talked about recruit and retain. But I think recruit, train, and retain. Because then you grow a person up through a career path effectively. So right now we're doing all the space training for a bunch of our coalition partners, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Kuwait, Dubai. And what we do with them is we create a course that's fitting for what they require. So even with the cool stuff that's happening with the New York Guard in Brazil, creating a training environment that meets their need but doesn't exceed that is what's really important. And then at the end, as the Space Force proliferates and grows, the people can migrate back and forth from industry to DOD and back again, and that makes them better in both lanes.
Thank you, Scott. Josh, with your new role at Raytheon Intelligence Space, talk to us about your role in terms of the talent acquisition, your challenges that you face to fill those roles in a dual career path.
Brad, thanks for letting me be here today. This is the first time I've ever been to a Space Force presentation. I'm brand new to the space industry, so does that make me officially a space cadet? No, really, this is it's an honor to be here, Brad. And and my experience as being a reservist for over 20 years, and meeting that demand of maintaining my civilian life and my professional military life and my family all at the same time. It's just impossible to juggle all three at the same time if you don't have a supportive employer. And so part of, me learning about the Space Force, what I was surprised at, it was how small it is for the reserve side. I'd really think that operationally the demand for these types of positions would be a lot more, and it should be 10 times the size that it is initially. And as an industry, I know all of us that work in this industry, there's a huge talent demand. At Raytheon, we have over 170,000 employees. Just in our division alone, we have 35,000 employees, and we're all competing for that same talent. And so why compete against the military for that talent when we can develop it and shape it together? And that's really what our goals are, is to see how do we build programs and models and pilots to do that.
Thanks, Josh. Let's take that another step further in terms of molding that talent. And I think, Scott, your area of that train both directions between, space operators and your programs there. How do you and Josh work together?
Well, we've got great relationships, and in fact, we're doing some work with Raytheon right at this moment on their space processes and some of their strategic vision relative to that. As we talk to large industry partners and small industry partners, because what's really interesting about space is that there are great companies like Raytheon and Oracle and very large companies, L3 doing great things, but there's a gajillion little companies. I live in Texas, San Antonio. Austin has hundreds of super cool little app developers that make relationships with Raytheon and other great large companies and bring that skill set to bear. And so what's important is how do you train somebody to apply those exotic and esoteric, we talked a little bit about data scientists earlier and AI and ML. How do you bring those skill sets into a space domain seamlessly and help to understand how those applications work? And so always remember that there are 5 warfighting domains: air, land, sea, space, cyber. And cyber and space are very much, there's very little light between those two domains. They're both enablers of each other. And then underpinning that is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So those as a package, we talked a little bit about convergence warfare earlier. Somebody asked a question, and it was spot on. These are where the convergence happens. So the convergence should happen operationally within those 5 warfighting domains, and that convergence should happen between government and industry, big companies and small companies, to be effective in space, whether it's on the commercial or the government side.
Alicia, in your role with the Army Reserve, one of the challenges is the unemployment rate being at just over 11%. And given today's employment environment, is that due to companies not understanding the reserve component or the ESGR issues? What do you think is driving that employment rate to be so high?
Well, probably several reasons, a couple which you mentioned, but I also think from our perspective, the office that I work in, the program had been defunct for 3 years. I just came on board just a little over a year ago, standing it back up. And so our challenge really is getting the word out to, the lower level, down into the units, that we're back and that we are here to assist, our soldiers in getting good career paths and our spouses as well. I always throw the military spouses in there because hiring them is as important too. So for us, it's really a communication piece, but then also the understanding that, if you are a TPU soldier, the drilling soldier, that you're not necessarily stuck in a unit or an MOS. So the Army Reserve does have some flexibility that if you want to change your MOS to maybe reflect what you do in your civilian job, you have the flexibility to do that. It could mean you have to move your unit, but on the flip side of that, it could be that, hey, you want to chase after this really good job and you're willing to relocate, which means then you're going to be changing a unit. So we have flexibilities built in there. And that's where the retention piece comes in for us is, why do you need to leave the Army Reserve? Well, because I can't afford to get to drill weekend because I can't put gas in my car. oh, well, gee, let us help you get into a good career path. And oh, by the way, training with industry is a huge model for me through the SkillBridge program. Companies are willing to foot the bill for that training for our soldiers because they want the talent so desperately.
Thank you. Josh, to throw that kind of back to your side on the importance of dual careers so that we have the retention factors, and what are you looking for as a company?
You know, supporting, as a company supporting reservists in their continued service in the military, you know, it's our responsibility. It's our national security. So the more we support a civilian career, the more we train them in an industry, in a cutting edge technology, the better prepared and more ready soldier they are. And we can contribute to our national security that way. You know, Brad, building a dual career path, you know, Alicia, we had a meeting earlier and she talked about, well, we have truck drivers in the Army, or we have doctors in the Army or in the civilian life, but when they join the Army, they want to do something different. You know, they get to do something different in their life, you know, and having that culture change and changing the narrative that it's expensive to have a reservist on your company, and looking back and building the business case, like, look, you may lose a reservist to a deployment for 12 months periodically or for 6 months periodically, but during that time, they're not just sitting on their hands. They're getting life experience and training that you can't train them in as a company. They're getting a fresh perspective. They're getting new challenges to where they're having to be resilient and adjust to. And really building that case, having internal culture change as a company to really be supportive of that dual, you know, that service in the military is really important. But really the narrative needs to be focused and changed, that, you know, we need to promote service in our military and service to our country and provide an environment to where you're not having to sacrifice your family because you want to be in the military and be in the reserve and have a good civilian job. We need to build that as supportive partnership so that families are stronger and they're healthier.
Thanks, Josh. Scott, how do we bridge that gap then to get the programs like Alicia was talking about, the training, the certificates, generally, you know, beyond what you all do, but generally speaking from a training perspective, between the two spheres?
Well, one is, so in industry, you are kind of expected to come to the party trained and at least have the essential skills of, you know, becoming an engineer or a salesman or even, you know, that there are kind of skill sets. And industry has some training programs, but it's not nearly as specified and articulate as DoD training programs. So step one for us is we have a little dialogue with the potential customer, the potential training site, and say, okay, what describe the person that you're trying to build here, and what things do they come to the table with, and what things do they need to have to be successful in the job that you're asking them to do. And then we create blocks of instruction or cobble together blocks of instruction so that they can get to that place no matter where they are. And again, the way to train in 2022 is an overarching process called the Socratic method, where there's a kind of a short, the students are expected to come to the class with some knowledge. There's a short lecture. There's a lot of cohort learning, and we can do this virtually or we can do this in person, but that there's a lot of interaction because people tend to retain more when they talk about it and then they write about it. The hard part in government sometimes, and even with SkillBridge, we've got 2 SkillBridge people in process right now. And sometimes, depending on the organization, just getting through the paperwork and getting approved and getting on board with a SkillBridge capability can be really hard. And so we found that it's easier when we collaborate with industry or with government and create sort of a tailored, very focused training event so that at the end, those young men and women are ready to contribute in the most effective way for that unit.
Alicia, real quick on some of the numbers we were talking about this morning in our Citizen War Coalition meeting about of the roughly 35 million Americans that are in the ages of 17 to 24, but when you go through all the reasons they can't serve, medical, et cetera, and propensity to serve, this is an astounding number. It drops down to just over 300,000. and we lose about 200,000 a year. So retention becomes a big issue. So how do we focus on keeping those folks? And we talked a lot today about numbers of the cost to train, et cetera, the ROI of a person. How does this factor good civilian jobs as part of that whole civilian readiness?
Right. So we're actually had talked to Recruiting Command a few weeks ago out at Fort Knox, and specifically General Daphne Davis, who represents the Army Reserve for recruiting. We're going to do a pilot with the 5th Battalion in Texas. From a recruitment standpoint, if we target that 17 to 20-year-old that's just coming out of high school, or, is decided now I need to join, the Army Reserve or pick a component, right? Because I need money and I can't find a job, which I don't know why they can't find a job, but that's a second conversation. And so we want to connect with them early on in that recruiting process to say, once you've, completed your basic training and your AIT, come back to us and let us help you do career exploration. So get them early on thinking about what do you want to do in your civilian world, early on, so that they know they have that connection point to go back to immediately once they've completed that training. Because let's face it, if you're 18, 19 years old, you complete your basic training, now what do I do? Because you really haven't really thought through the process of, oh, now I can have a job because I'm only going to do this military job part-time. And so we want to catch them early on. And then the thought process long-term would be, because we, P3 Army Reserve, got them connected into a good career path, then the odds of them, or the likelihood of them staying in, probably, the percentage goes up, because they'll look back and say, oh, the Army Reserve helped me get into this good career field.
Classic, take care of your people.
Exactly.
So, Josh, when you were with the Century Group, a program that I was very impressed with is called Breaking Solid Ground. And I just had the opportunity to go to a groundbreaking for as an energy company for Natural Gas Pipeline Academy. And Josh, just share that story with how you're bringing people in and to start both dual career from the start.
With Century, Brad, it was Job Corps was one of our community partners that really touched and resonated with a lot of our employee base. Job Corps has 60,000 students nationwide. There's 137 units. They meet all the requirements typically to join the military, minus the medical piece. They meet the education, the background checks, et cetera. But what we wanted to do in our partnership with Job Corps is we train them in the construction industry, got them certified to work on our pipeline, then we encouraged them to join the reserve component. And so we had some Marines, we had some Air Force, they had a job when they went back. But what we found is that these employees that we've sent to the reserves for that military training, although we lost them for a good 6 months to 8 months for training, we fast-tracked them to foreman. So they were promoted quicker and were a more valuable employee with us when they got back from training.
Great, thanks, Josh, for sharing that. We'll open up to questions here, but as we do that, would you all just kind of open panel here, share your perspective on the benefit to corporate America for hiring reserve component members, and then if you switch it back to the benefit to the force, in this case, the Space Force, for hiring reserve component members, or in your case, Alicia, the Army.
So the benefit that obviously an Army Reserve soldier and any reserve component service member brings to the table is, discipline, physically fit, drug-free, leadership skills, and that's what I talk to employers about. And a lot of cases, the security clearance is huge, especially I would think in Space Force is going to be a huge asset. And then the beauty of that for the employer is, guess what? The reserve component pays to maintain that security clearance. So that's a cost that company doesn't have to bear, or the length of time that it takes for a company to get just a civilian off the street a security clearance is upward to 2 years. And so that's one of the things, especially I think will be important with Space Force, is that, the security clearances.
Scott?
Well, so when somebody is committed to anything, and in this case the military, they're a better employee. I mean, I worked a lot of jobs in my life, and if there was a guy that was like putting out doing the thing, the go-to guy, a lot of times he was a military dude or military lady, gal. And so it is not it's not about simply that they were there, but it's the skills and the commitment that they learned. So for industry, getting a person from the military is really cool. The challenge oftentimes is that some of the military skills that a guy or a gal brings are not one-to-one applicable. So, if he was a maintainer of trucks or a person who did administration or anything like that, it's not always a one-to-one applicability. And so that point of training and making those transitions is a really important one. But in the case of Space Force, there are tons and tons of technology-based and orbital science-based positions that are seamless. A lot of military. So we do a lot of work with Five Eyes. So that would be UK, New Zealand, France, Germany, Canada. And thank you, sir. Not Germany, UK, France, not France, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and us, and the United States. Those are the Five Eyes. I should know this. Please don't downgrade my score because of my failure here. But the point is that a lot of those countries already have a program where you can essentially come out of the military for a sabbatical period, go work in industry, and then come back to the military and not have lost your rank or anything like that. So the more it is of benefit to our country if we can do those kinds of things where those cultural exchanges are made, and training is received either on the civilian side or the military side that has applicability and success to each side of that fence. And before you know it, there'll be Six Eyes and there'll be industry in that equation.
Thanks, Scott. Josh?
Brad, the dual credentialing piece that they bring up, I think as we look at our society and we look at building workforces and we look at partnering together, doing double work and having redundancy sometimes isn't the best for our soldiers. So I think really exploring what was discussed earlier about how does that training equate on both sides is really important to explore. But I really feel the future, at least of the Space Force, you have to rely on industry to help build your workforce. You don't have time or the resources to train on the cutting edge. You have to rely on industry to do that. So the more we can explore that reserve component, partnerships.
And we know that Space Force is one of the first to do direct commissioning. So as skill sets are identified, they are recruiting people into higher ranks and higher positions of responsibility without having to go through the normal progression to get there. Why? Because those skills are reflected in those positions and in those areas of responsibilities, not unlike the medical corps. The medical corps does the same thing. You can be recruited as a more senior person if you're, a high-end surgeon or another kind of person that those responsibilities are equated to a higher rank.
Do you have any questions from the audience or the online?
One of the items we talked about this morning in the Citizen Warrior Coalition, the Citizen Warrior Coalition is an initiative by ROA with the support of some wonderful partners to help individual members of the Reserve and Guard be ready, because of course ROA's mission is readiness. It's not getting you another $1.56 for your disabled left knee. It's readiness. So we have, over the last 20 odd years, we have berated America's employers to be patriotic. We've worked on job banks. We've done all kinds of things to facilitate the ability of members of the Reserve and Guard to serve and their employers to support them. ROA, as you saw in the short video that I presented, is working on tax credits for employers of the Guard and Reserve, which are indexed to deployments. If your employee deploys, you get more tax credit. If they deploy for longer, you get more tax credit. Another thing that we're going to do, it's going to be a fight for quite a while, I think, is ROA believes that if you are required to fight tonight, you're the ready reservist, you should have 24/7, 365 health care. Basically prime or what have you, but you should not be required to go between your civilian health care provider when you're not on active duty and then switch over to a military health care provider when you go on active duty, which introduces all kinds of continuity of care issues. We think it reduces readiness, and it certainly, if something like this were to come to be, and it will be an ROA legislative priority, it will incentivize employers because it reduces their financial burden if they don't have to provide health care. So this is one of the things that ROA will be doing, because you can only beat up on an employer so much to make them want to hire you and retain you. They're already doing a pretty darn good job of it. So that's one of the things that we're trying to do, a pull system here instead of just pushing.
Thoughts on what General said?
General Phillips, it's true, but I will tell you that that employers have been supportive of our total force for 20 years and so again, you are right. In 2022, we collectively, we America, have to adapt to how do we maximize the benefit for industry, and how do we maximize the other than patriotism. All companies are very patriotic, but the burden of 20 years of Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, fill in the blank, we need across the board training, retention, all of it. We need to be creative, and I hope we can. But healthcare is a good idea.
We invite the Space Force Association to join us in the fight.
Hippie says on board. Launch away.
Any other questions? Anything from online? All right. Well, thank you all for joining us here this afternoon and sharing your perspective, the corporate perspective. We can't go home without that at all. So thank you, guys.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Watch your step. And Scott, thank you for your.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again to our corporate panel members to talk about the importance of the reserve component in support of their mission set. Our final speaker for today, General Retired Joseph L. Lengyel, board member, Space Force Association. But before he joined the Space Force Association, General Lengyel retired from the Air Force as a 4-star general. His final military assignment was as a chief of the National Guard Bureau, where he also served as a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In this capacity, he was a military advisor to the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council, and was the Department of Defense's official channel of communication to the governors and the state adjutant generals on all matters pertaining to the National Guard. As the most senior National Guard officer in the nation, General Lengyel was responsible to oversee the $28 billion Army and Air National Guard budgets, making sure 450,000 members of the National Guard were trained and ready across the spectrum of all National Guard military capabilities. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome General Joseph Lengyel.
Hey, thanks. Very good. Thank you. Okay, well, thanks everybody. It's great to be here, and I was an active duty general, and now I am doing business as Joseph L. Lengyel, citizen, United States. That's and I think that I want to thank ROA for hosting this. General Phillips, thanks for everybody, and the Space Force Association for bringing these together. This discussion is an important discussion. It is a very important discussion.
And as I sit here and I listen today and I wonder if our nation really is having a discussion about this. Are the right people here? Is everybody putting all the facts on the table? Our personal agendas set aside? Are we doing what is best for the nation? Are we doing what's best for the Space Force? Are we doing what's best for the United States of America? And there's people not here at this thing today that should be here. To have this discussion, I don't know why the National Guard Bureau is not here. I don't know why the Space Force is not here. I don't know why OMB, who's involved in some of these discussions, are not here. We are not having this discussion the way we should be having this discussion. So I think, I feel obligated to tell you that you might know that I am, without a doubt, an avid supporter of a Space National Guard. I believe that our current system, the system of a reserve, the system of a National Guard, the system of supported by an active component, of a strong active component that's part of an active component, it works. I believe the insinuation that hey, we have this new service and we have to do something completely new, first of all, is a valid consideration. We should be always looking to do things new. But as we have talked about things here today, the National Guard, the reserves, our total force, regardless of service, is not what it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago. It has adapted. It has innovated. It is a new, modern, combat-proven total force. For more than 30 years, we've been at war. We've been mobilizing our force in what may have been a more difficult scenario than World War II. I mean, when you think about total full mobilization where everyone is mobilized and in their services till the end of the war plus 6 months, well, that's a big bite. That costs a lot of money. But, it's sort of pretty easy to maneuver. Everybody can do with everybody what they want for as long as they want until the end of the war plus 6 months. We had to do it one Social Security number at a time. We had to take people and bring them up and keep them trained and mobilize them and assign them and get them to do wartime duties under partial mob authority, for not more than 2 years. It was mobilized by Social Security. It was an incredibly complex thing to do, to watch the Army do it and watch the Navy do it and watch everybody else do it. So I think we ought to answer a couple of questions here. Somebody brought up, has anybody talked about this, before? Is this the first meeting that we have talked about? No, absolutely not. It's not the first meeting. I've been retired for 2 years. But I say with all certainty and direct knowledge that this was talked about a lot inside the Department of the Air Force, inside the Space Force, inside the National Guard Bureau, inside the Pentagon, inside the Congress. The whole time I was there, Congress directed the Department of the Air Force to provide reports, the Space Force to provide reports on, give me your best recommendation on what the architecture of this new service should look like with respect to the reserve components. And we did it. We started, we sat there, we collaborated, we wrote it down, we put facts and data together to come up with a report. And there's a report sitting somewhere in the Pentagon that says, here is what we recommend. And I can tell you what we recommended. We recommended a two-component system, a Space Force that was comprised of what you heard about on here today, the sort of integration of the Air Force reserves and an active component. Not sure yet what we were going to call all of those various different pieces, but that was going to be an entity. And as they tried to accommodate and absorb and utilize all the components inside the National Guard, the only real way to do it was to create a Space National Guard component to go with it. And, as I retired from the Air Force in 2020, September 2020, Secretary of the Air Force, at the time Secretary Barrett, Secretary of the, Chief Staff of the Air Force, Dave Goldfein, CSO Space Force, Jay Raymond, myself, all members, our staffs came together with those plans, and we were all in agreement and recommended to the Congress that that was the preferred, our best military advice, architecture of what the Space Force might look like with respect to components. So I say with some certainty that was done. And as I mentioned before, I think the new compos have been integrating 3 decades of military operations, Iraq, Afghanistan, wars around the world. You know, the model of mobilization that we worked may have been probably the most stressed. The most stressed maybe not just for service members, but also for employers as we did it. And the utilization of our National Guard and Reserve component forces, 800,000 of them, over a million deployments, some multiple deployments, was certainly stressful, particularly in low density and high demand career fields. But I think, you know, that was important, and the ability and the authorizations to mobilize those forces were not by accident. And, you know, as they create this new Space Force, one of the things you hear is that a single component with all of the force structure under the Chief of Space Operations, you know, that is a different model than our nation has. Our nation has a model, a system that is built on the requirement, the need to access the reserve component to go to war. That's not by accident. Congress does not want the Department of Defense or any service chief or any service secretary to be able to, on his own, mobilize his or her own, mobilize the forces they need to go have a war with China or Russia or any major contingency operation. And, you know, access to the reserve component is kind of a recurring theme and friction inside the Pentagon. Well, we'd like to have more reserves, but you just can't get them. And it's important to remember that the reserves really have nothing to do with the authorities that allow access to the reserve component. Mobilization authorities are all in law. They are written and established by the United States Congress. Why? Because they want to have a say when and if our nation goes to war, and when and if the reserve components become mobilized so that we can go do it and go do it successfully. We have reserve components because when you go to war, you want to increase the capacity of the force. You need to grow the force. You need more capability. And, you know, sometimes you need to replace forces that are attrition forces. They are killed or destroyed in battle. That may not be the case in a Space Force, but you may need more squadrons. You may need more people to monitor space operations. You may need more people to do various space things, and that requires more capacity, which our nation simply can't afford to have all in the active force. So anyway, I would offer that, you know, the access to the reserves, is there friction to access the reserve? You bet there is. But that friction is every bit intentional. It is supposed to be hard to mobilize the force, and Congress is what gets to say to do it. I'm all for innovative work rules and statuses, and, you know, I think it's important, the concept as we talk about the force, that, you know, a new service and all of our services, we talked a lot about duty status reform and making it easier to people transition from part-time to full-time and active duty to reserve status and back and forth. All of those things true. It is true that those are sometimes onerous and it is difficult to do. And we should work hard to make sure that we can make those as easy and as seamless as possible. But one thing that our reserve components do is they are built by and with and through and for the traditional reservist. Sometimes as I hear this discussion they talk about the reservist as if it's a, you know, when they're not thinking about anything else. They go to work in the Army Reserve or the Air Force Reserve or the Space Force Reserve, and then they leave and they go home, and they're thinking about all the next time that they might have to come and do their military duty. But the actual truth is, our traditional reservists, they're farmers, and they're engineers, and they're lawyers, and they're doctors, and they're mechanics, and they're teachers, and they're police officers. Most of the time, they're not thinking about their military duty. What we do as reserve components is we enable them to have two careers. We enable them to be a farmer, or a teacher, or a lawyer, or a doctor, or a consultant, or whatever it is that they do. And when our nation needs them, when Congress says you are authorized to mobilize them, they are trained and they are ready. And that's what our reserve force components do. It's a question I have about this new service, this new force. Who is going to take care of the traditional reservist? You know, this is a lot more than having some duty status that a new mom can now become a part-timer and not have to be a full-timer in the Space Force, which is traditionally what you hear is, oh, it'll be great. when someone, becomes a mom, they won't have to stay full-time. They can transition to part-time for a while, and then they can come back and be full-time later when the kids get older and they get in school. Taking care of the part-time force is a lot more than that. The part-time force is not looking to go be part-time and then be full-time. They have businesses to run. They have things to do in their part-time lives, in their full-time lives that I think are important. So I think, I think that I thought I saw early on in this program that Arnold Panero was going to be here, and you have to talk about cost of the forces. You have to talk a little bit about the cost of the forces. And when Arnold Panero was the chairman of the Reserve Forces Policy Board, he did a fully burdened cost analysis of the reserve components. And it just shows you, one thing I learned when I worked in this town is I never trust a number that I have not manipulated myself, And so I can show you that we're more expensive. I can show you that we cost less. I can show you that we cost more. I can show you need 6 to 1, whatever it is I want to show you. But I'm just asking you to think about it. A brigade combat team in the Army that's got 4,000 people in it, if they're not mobilized and you're not paying them because they're at their civilian job, you're saving a lot of money every single day. And then you got to train them up. You get them to go to war when you need them, and they cost the same when you use them. But it's just less expensive. You pay them less in retirement. You don't have golf courses. You don't have bowling alleys, gyms. They generally have employer-paid health care insurance or some other method, but they cost the United States of America less. And I think it's important that as we consider costs, we look at the opportunity for us to have the Space Force have access to that same thing. And we talk about the Air National Guard has been in the space business since 1995. We had a little bit of this conversation during some of the discussion. I think it's really important. As we look at this, and we mentioned earlier, General Raymond said, can't do it without the Guard. General Hyten says we can't do it without the Guard. General Thompson says we can't do it without the Guard. Almost everybody out there says, we said, what's going to happen to all those units if there's not a transition? Well, there's only two things that can happen. If someone puts a gun to their head and says, look, you're either going to get out of the Guard and go join this new service, or we're going to have to find some other job for you to do, some other specialty, some other mission set. Or if they really want to play hardball, they say, look, either get in a new service or you go away. And then you talk about political problems of, hey, you're going to shut down a unit in my state and all the rest of that stuff, and that hurts it. And, I think who's against this and why are they against this in terms of the National Guard? Frankly, it's because, I think the first thing Colonel Stanley said when he got up here is, well, hey, I'm Title 32. I can say whatever I want. I don't have to espouse the administration position. And that is just a burr in the saddle of this town, and they'd rather not have to deal with that. And they'd rather not have to deal with some governor who says, well, my forces aren't going to take the COVID shot or whatever it is. It's that friction that sometimes causes problem where people say, if I have to have a choice, would I choose to select a component that has Title 32 and the state piece? But as we talked about this, the need to have the discussion, the need to talk about how much does it really cost. And I would stand here with all 39 years of my retirement pay on the thing, and I would tell you that, hey, $600 million to have a Space National Guard is an absurd number. It is not anywhere close to having a cost of $600 million. So I thought I would address one more thing, because as we had this discussion, we've had a lot of people talk about, they ask the question, and I know right away what side of the fence they're on when they ask this question. They say, well, so tell me, why does a governor need a Space National Guard? And, so as soon as somebody says that, I understand, well, they either just, are looking for a fight, or they don't understand what the National Guard does. The National Guard, first of all, there's a National Guard because a long time ago somebody decided, hey, we want the forces in the militias. We don't want the forces in a big federal state that the king can use against us. That's why we're not there because of hurricanes. We're not in the states because of tornadoes or fires. That has kind of come on as kind of a secondary thing that we do to take care of people in our domestic role. Our domestic role, we save lives, we protect property, we mitigate human suffering. But The reason we're in the Guard is because people didn't want big military force structures in the federal force. But what really, and if you think about the Guard, we are the combat reserve, proudly say, of the United States Army and the United States Air Force. If with a stroke of a pen, you can add 27 brigades active duty to the Army tomorrow, if Congress says you can. You can add 24 fighter squadrons. You can add 450,000 people. We have trained, ready forces, ready to go and go to war and do whatever our nation needs it to do. But I think that, governors have F-16s and F-22s and C-17s and M1 tanks and Apache helicopters and M4 rifles and all kinds of various different things that governors don't really need to do state domestic operations. But what we do have as a Guard is we have the unique ability to be mobilized by the governor in times of crisis. And that is what the Guard does. And between the two, we can be mobilized by the president and the governor. The governor can make you leave your job, your work, your home, and go do something for the state. And it's a unique attribute of the Guard. And so I would ask this question. If you're going to create a reserve component, why would you create a reserve component that could only be mobilized for one thing? When you have a choice to create a reserve component that could be mobilized to do a federal thing, and that federal thing is always prime, it always takes precedent. If they want it, it always wins. But if you're in dwell and somebody needs you to do something else, like take care of fires or hurricanes or wildfires or food banks or test sites for pandemic response and COVID, then you have an opportunity to choose to have a component that could be mobilized for two reasons. And it's beyond my understanding why you would choose not to select a component that could be mobilized by both things. So again, I think that this is a good discussion. And I think it's an important discussion. And what I would like to see, if you were to ask me, what could ROA do for us? I would say you could have a panel. And you could have a panel with OMB sitting in that chair, and Chief of the National Guard Bureau, and Chief of the Space Force, and maybe Secretary of the Air Force if they'd come, or an old one, or an old retired GO like me. I'll sit up there if you want. And let's throw it on the table. And bring your facts with you and say what you need. And the space domain is an important domain. And it's a new domain. And I grew up in the Air Force. I'm an airman through and through for 38 years. And I think about things like, the unique attributes of the Air Force were speed, range, and flexibility. And when you look at the Space Force, they take speed, range, and flexibility to a whole new level. It is a domain that touches every other domain. It is the domain that is going to enable command and control, joint domain, all domain command and control, the ability to select any sensor with any shooter, the ability to make decisions faster, better, more accurately than our enemies in the future. We can't go to war without it. It is the way of the future. So anyway, I think it's very important that you get those people sitting up in that chair. They'll never all come. They'll all have someplace else to be. But I think that having that discussion such that the people in Congress who are going to make this decision and make this decision relatively soon, our nation has a lot of hard decisions to make. This is not one of them. They should create a Space National Guard. They should have done it in December of 2019 when they created the Space Force. They should have stood it up on the same day, just like they did with the Air Force. And, I say with some certainty that it would be a mistake not to create a Space National Guard component. Okay? Thank you very much. I'm ready for your questions.
He's answered all my questions.
Really? Come on. Somebody online? One of the things that makes us so successful as a reserve component, and this applies to every reserve component, is that we exactly mirror the training, the standards, the culture of our parent service. Everywhere you go, an airman is an airman, a soldier is a soldier, a sailor is a sailor, and when you go to the battlefield, you seamlessly integrate because you have had the same training, the same teachers, the same schools, the same standards, the same requirements, and there is no difference. You know, it's kind of passé now to say, like, hey, I couldn't tell the difference between a Guard person and a reservist on the battlefield. Well, no kidding. We've been fighting wars together for 30 years. We grew up together for 30 years, been exercising for 30 years. It's all the same. It has been a great gift, if there's such a thing as a gift of 30 years of combat operations, that we have the most operationally capable, ready, best equipped, same equipped military force, total force in the history of our country. It has been a great gift. Okay, here comes a question. I can stop talking now.
We have one online question, which you may just answer, sir, is, are there unique challenges faced by RC members of Space Force that differ from other RCs, reserve components? Unique educational preparation, for example. How does that challenge recruiting efforts?
Yeah, I think that you know, from my standpoint, having watched the integration of our force as part of the total force, they must exactly mirror that of the parent service. There can be no difference between whatever an active guardian does, a reserve or a National Guard guardian must have the same kinds of training and capability. You know, I think the integration of all of those kinds of capabilities, and you know, I didn't really touch on the connection to our communities, but you know, keeping the military connected to different parts of America is a very important thing that the reserve components do. And in lots of states, there are no major active military installations, but they see somebody in a uniform, it's because they're an Army Guardsman or an Army Reservist or someone along those lines. And you know, I think the Space Force is going to have to work hard because, one, it's a small force. You know, there's a couple dozen state National Guards that are bigger than the entire Space Force. You know, I mean, that's the nature of the business. But I think that keeping that connection to the reserve components is an important thing.
Well, we all remember when the Army Air Corps was a very small organization, and I projected the Space Force. We all remember.
I read about it.
Those were the good old days, and it grew. And I think the Space Force will grow. The Air Force, I think, manages its reservists very, very efficiently with your associate unit programs and affiliate. The Army is different. You know, if you're in an infantry battalion, you probably don't have a reserve component associate member program. Can you describe, General, how that might work to advantage with the Space Force?
Yeah, no, I think you know, as you mentioned, they are different models. You know, the Army's reserve program is more along the professional side, the doctors and the lawyers and the medical professionals. The Air Force, although I have suggested that, you know, I don't know why they don't have associate units inside their aviation units inside the Army. They should, and they don't. You know, but I think you know, I think that, you know, the model and the readiness model of the Air Force, it's a different readiness model. The readiness of the Air Force is they're funded to maintain the same readiness as the active component. Not true on the Army side. They're funded to maintain a lower level of readiness until they're mobilized, and then they speed it up. I think that the Space Force would probably fall more along the lines of the Air Force model, that you know, they would be funded to maintain the same sort of levels of the readiness. And the associate program is a good thing. But, you know, as I mentioned earlier on, I think, you know, we bring different products. You know, as you were talking about the reserve space capabilities inside the Air Force, almost all of those are IMAs. They're individual augmentees to go help launch operations or other things. Whereas in the Guard model, we're predominantly units. We don't have IMAs. We have you know, the unit-based reports. So you can grow the Air Force by a unit and deploy it with a commander and a vice commander and enlisted forces and everything below it. So you don't have to train them in times of war. They're already built and trained and equipped.
Sir, one of the things you touched upon was, well, one of the things that we hear often is, you Guard guys, you're too hard to get at. Right, you're under the state, and you're too hard to get at. And you touched upon it. It's well, Congress makes those laws, rewrite the laws.
Exactly. You know, I mean, the mobilization authorities are exactly the same to mobilize a Guardsman as a reservist. They're no different. It is no easier to mobilize a Title X reservist as it is a National Guardsman. You either have authority or you don't. I think that access complaint, if you will, Guard has nothing to do with deciding when we're authorized to be mobilized. That is all Congress. What we do in the Guard, maybe even a little bit more than the reservists, is we go mobilize ourselves in volunteer status. We'll volunteer and go do a tour on days, and here you go, all the rest of that stuff. And we won't require them to mobilize us. Sometimes it's people that want jobs, and they go, hey, I'll go fly for 30 days in this place. Give me a set of orders, and I'll go do it. But the mobilization aspect is you're spot on. We have nothing to do. Mobilization authorities are written in law, and
That's our retort to that. Is we'll keep Guard not in control of that. We'll talk to Congress.
and by the way, your mobilization authorities are exactly the same as the reservists. The only difference is your Governor Hochul can also mobilize you, and they can't a reservist. So it's just a different thing.
Yeah, sir. And what about same concept? That if you do a Space National Guard, you're gonna have 54 Space National Guards. Right now, there's 7 and 1, as you said. How do you get to 54 like that? How do you do that?
Yeah, there's no requirement to get to 54 National Guards. There's no requirement to have one in state. Any growth of should they create a Space National Guard, any growth would, one, have to be vetted through the Secretary of the Air Force. It has to be approved and gone through the Department of the Air Force through the programmatic process. And then as we know, because we do it every year, we take that budget and we bring it up here and we send it to the Hill and we say, please approve this. And they go, well, and they start redlining things and taking things in and taking things out. So the only growth to any military structure, active Guard or reserve, is only that approved by the Service Secretary and then finally by the Hill. Guards and states cannot grow force structure on their own without the approval of Secretary. Will they want it? Sure, everybody wants force structure. Look at the fight over where they're putting the headquarters for the Space Force. Is that going to be in Alabama? Is that going to be in Alabama? Is it going to be in Colorado? Where's that going to be? There's nothing Guard about that, and there's a huge political fight over where it's going to be. People want jobs, equipment, MILCON, force structure in their states, and that will never change, regardless of component. It is not a unique Guard thing. It is people want things in their states.
I was just going to make a point to the Mobilization Authority. ROA, this was in the depth of 2020 during the pandemic relief, and we were mobilizing Guard and reservists to cities and states around the country. And our executive director, Jeff Phillips, wrote a letter to President Trump saying if you use a national mobilization under Title 10 authority, you can save the states a whole lot of money who are trying to mobilize individual state Guard members to work within their own state. And the president listened, and we saved America a whole lot of money, and the governors in the states.
It's good.
Wilson, thank you very much for coming out here.
Okay.
I appreciate it. Thank you for your lifetime of service to our nation.
Thank you.
And the service that you have yet to provide.
Honored to be here. Thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate it.
That concludes our Reserve Education Forum on Space Forces, the Reserve Component Force Multiplication. Thank you to all our speakers and to our guests and to our virtual folks out there. Thank you for tuning in. We appreciate all your effort and time. All right.